The last fare to nowhere. My name is Sato Hiroshi, and I have been driving taxis in Tokyo for 32 years. In all that time, I thought I had seen everything the night shift could offer. Drunk salarymen vomiting in my back seat, crying office ladies going through messy divorces, teenagers sneaking home after breaking curfew. The city never sleeps, and neither do its problems. But nothing in 3 decades of night driving prepared me for what happened on March 15th, 2023. It was just past 3 in the morning when I pulled up to the taxi stand outside Shibuya Station. The last trains had stopped running hours ago, and the usual crowd of stranded partygoers had mostly found their way home or into 24-hour internet cafes. The March air still held winter's bite, and I was considering calling it a night when I saw him. He stood perfectly straight under a street lamp, wearing an impeccable dark blue business suit that looked expensive even from a distance. His posture was formal, almost rigid, like he was standing at attention. What struck me most was how still he was. Everyone else on the street moved with the loose, tired gestures of people who had been drinking or staying up too late. This man looked like he had just stepped out of a board meeting. I pulled up alongside him and rolled down my window. Taxi. He approached with measured steps and slid into the back seat with barely a sound. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, I could see he was middle-aged, maybe 50, with graying hair neatly combed and wire-rimmed glasses. His hands were folded precisely in his lap. "Good evening," I said, turning on the meter. "Where to?" He gave me an address in Setagaya Ward. I knew the area well, a quiet residential neighborhood with narrow streets and older apartment buildings. Nothing unusual about the destination, though it would be a decent fare. "Hi, understood," I replied, pulling away from the curb. The first thing that struck me was the silence. Most passengers at this hour either fall asleep immediately or want to talk about their troubles. This man sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead. I tried making conversation a few times, asking about the weather or mentioning how quiet the roads were, but he didn't respond. Not rude, just absent somehow. As we drove through Shibuya and toward Setagaya, I found myself glancing more often in the rearview mirror. Something about his stillness made me uneasy. He hadn't moved since getting in the car. His hands remained folded in exactly the same position, and he never looked out the windows or checked his phone like most passengers do. 20 minutes into the drive, we entered the residential streets of Setagaya. The address he had given me should have been coming up soon, but as I navigated the narrow roads, I began to feel confused. I had been driving in this area for decades, but somehow the streets didn't look quite right. The buildings seemed older than I remembered, and some of the street signs were missing. "Excuse me," I called back to my passenger. "Could you repeat the address? I want to make sure I'm going to the right place." He gave me the same address, speaking for the first time since entering the taxi. His voice was clear but strangely flat, like he was reading from a script. I continued following my GPS, but the device seemed to be having trouble. It kept recalculating the route, showing streets that didn't match what I could see outside. The buildings around us grew more sparse, and I realized we had somehow moved from a residential area into what looked like an industrial district. "Sir, I think there might be some mistake," I said, pulling over to check my navigation system more carefully. "This address doesn't seem to exist." When I looked in the rearview mirror to see his reaction, my blood went cold. The back seat was empty. I turned around completely, thinking maybe he had somehow moved out of my line of sight, but the entire back seat was vacant. The door hadn't opened. I would have heard it, felt the change in air pressure, noticed the interior light coming on, but he was simply gone. My hands shaking, I checked the meter. It showed exactly 2,400 yen, a reasonable fare for the distance we had traveled. On the seat where my passenger had been sitting, I found the exact amount in crisp bills, along with a business card. I picked up the card with trembling fingers. It was for a company called Yamato Construction, with an address in central Tokyo. The man's name was printed as Tanaka Kenji, project manager. The card looked old, not yellowed exactly, but with that slightly stiff quality of older paper. I had no idea what to do. Part of me wanted to drive straight home and pretend this had never happened, but my curiosity and years of customer service training made me want to understand what had just occurred. I decided to follow the GPS to the address my passenger had given me. 10 minutes later, I found myself parked in front of an empty lot surrounded by a chain-link fence. Construction warning signs were posted around the perimeter, but they looked weathered and old. Through the fence, I could see nothing but bare earth and scattered debris. There was no building, no apartment complex, nothing that could have corresponded to the address he had given me. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. After getting some sleep, I decided to investigate the business card. I looked up Yamato Construction online, thinking maybe I could return the card or at least find some explanation for the strange encounter. What I found made my skin crawl. Yamato Construction had been a mid-sized building company that operated in Tokyo from 1968 to 1991. They had gone out of business after a series of construction accidents and financial scandals. The company had been dissolved for over 30 years. But that wasn't the worst part. When I searched for Tanaka Kenji, the name from the business card, I found a newspaper article from March 15, 1992, exactly 31 years to the day before my strange encounter. The article described a fatal car accident. Tanaka Kenji, age 51, a former project manager for Yamato Construction, had died in a collision while driving home from a late-night meeting. The accident had occurred in Setagaya Ward, at the intersection near the empty lot where my GPS had led me. According to the article, Tanaka-san had been struggling with depression and financial difficulties since the company's closure. Some witnesses suggested he might have driven into oncoming traffic intentionally. I stared at the newspaper photo accompanying the article. It was definitely the same man who had ridden in my taxi. Same wire-rimmed glasses, same formal posture, even wearing what looked like the same dark blue suit. The article mentioned that Tanaka-san had been on his way home from a final meeting with lawyers about the company's dissolution. He had been trying to secure unemployment benefits for the workers who had lost their jobs when Yamato Construction collapsed. The meeting had gone late, past 3 in the morning, and he had been unable to catch the last train home. The parallel was impossible to ignore. Here was a man who had died exactly 31 years earlier, trying to get home after a late meeting, unable to take the train, needing a taxi to reach an address that no longer existed. I drove back to the empty lot that afternoon, telling myself I just wanted to see it in daylight. The construction signs were indeed old, dating back to a project that had apparently been abandoned years ago. I asked some people in the neighboring buildings about the history of the lot. An elderly woman who ran a small convenience store nearby told me that there had been plans to build an apartment complex there in the early 2000s. But the project had stalled after several construction workers reported strange accidents and equipment failures. She said people in the neighborhood avoided the area, especially at night, because of bad feelings associated with the intersection. There was a terrible accident there many years ago, she told me, her voice dropping to a whisper. A salaryman died trying to get home to his family. People say his spirit still wanders around there, looking for a way home. Over the following weeks, I found myself driving past that intersection more often than I should have. I told myself I was just curious, but deep down I think I was hoping to see him again. Not because I wanted another supernatural encounter, but because something about his situation felt heartbreakingly incomplete. Here was a man who had dedicated his final months to helping his former coworkers, who had stayed out all night trying to secure benefits for people who had lost their jobs through no fault of their own. He had died trying to get home to his family, probably exhausted and stressed beyond measure. The idea that his spirit might still be attempting that final journey night after night for 31 years, filled me with a sadness I couldn't shake. I started carrying the business card in my wallet. I told myself it was just because I didn't know what else to do with it. But really, I think I wanted to keep some connection to Tanaka-san. In the months that followed, I made a point of learning more about Yamato Construction and the people who had worked there. The company had employed over 200 people when it went under. Many of them had been middle-aged workers with families to support. The construction industry was going through a difficult period in the early 90s, and finding new jobs had been nearly impossible for most of them. Tanaka-san had been one of the few managers who had stayed to help with the closure process instead of jumping to new companies while he could. I never saw him again in my taxi, but other drivers in my company started reporting similar experiences. Always around 3 a.m., always near Shibuya Station, always a well-dressed businessman wanting to go to an address in Setagaya that didn't exist. The descriptions matched perfectly. The exact fare left behind. The business card from a company that had been closed for decades. We started talking about it quietly among ourselves. None of us wanted to report it officially, afraid we would be thought crazy or unfit for duty. But word spread through the informal network of night shift drivers. Everyone knew about the ghost passenger, though nobody talked about it openly. Some of the younger drivers dismissed it as urban legend, but those of us who had been working the streets for decades understood. Tokyo is full of people who died with unfinished business, especially from the economic hardships of the early 90s. The city grew so fast, changed so quickly, that sometimes the dead couldn't keep up with the living. I kept driving my regular routes, but I made a point of being available near Shibuya Station around 3 a.m. whenever I could. Not because I wanted to see him again, but because I felt like someone should be there. If Tanaka-san was still making that final journey home, still trying to complete the task that had cost him his life, then the least I could do was be ready to help. The business card is still in my wallet, and I think it always will be. Sometimes, on quiet nights when I'm driving through Setagaya, I find myself hoping that someday his journey will end, that he'll finally make it home to whatever family was waiting for him on that night in March 1992. But until then, I'll keep the meter running. The Crying Woman of Route 246. My name is Yamamoto Kenji, and I'm a third-year economics student at Waseda University. To pay for my tuition and living expenses, I drive taxi part-time during the night shift for Nihon Kotsu. It's not glamorous work, but it pays better than convenience store jobs, and the flexible hours let me attend classes during the day. What I'm about to tell you happened over the course of 3 months in the spring of 2024, and I still can't drive along certain sections of Route 246 without feeling my hands shake on the steering wheel. Route 246 is one of Tokyo's major arterial roads, stretching from central Tokyo all the way out to the coast. During my shift, which runs from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., I spend a lot of time on this route, picking up late-night passengers, heading home to the suburbs. It's usually busy until around 2 in the morning, then becomes eerily quiet, except for the occasional drunk businessman or hospital worker getting off a late shift. The first time I saw her was on a rainy Thursday night in March. I was driving westbound near the Yoga District around 2:30 a.m. when I spotted a figure standing beside the road. At first glance, she looked like any other stranded passenger waiting for a taxi, but something made me slow down and look more carefully. She was a woman in her 30s, wearing a simple white dress that seemed too thin for the cold spring rain. Her long black hair hung wet around her face, and even from inside my car I could tell she was crying. Her shoulders shook with what looked like deep, desperate sobs. She stood at the edge of the road near a concrete barrier, right at the spot where Route 246 curves over a deep ravine. I recognized the location immediately. Every taxi driver in Tokyo knows about that curve. It's been a suicide spot for decades. The barrier is there specifically to prevent people from jumping, but it doesn't always work. I had heard stories from other drivers about picking up distraught passengers near that spot, people in crisis who needed help getting to hospitals or police stations. I pulled over and rolled down my passenger window. "Excuse me, are you all right? Do you need help?" She looked up at me, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. Her face was pale, almost translucent in the streetlight, and her eyes were red and swollen from crying. But what struck me most was the expression of desperate hope that crossed her features when she saw my taxi. "Please," she said, her voice barely audible over the rain. "Please, I need to go home. I need to see my children." "Of course," I replied, unlocking the doors. "Get in and tell me where you need to go." She took a step toward the car, still crying, still clutching at her thin dress. But as she reached for the door handle, something strange happened. Her figure seemed to flicker, like a television with bad reception. I blinked hard, thinking it was just the rain on my windshield affecting my vision. When I looked again, she was gone. I sat there for several minutes, engine running, staring at the empty sidewalk. There was nowhere she could have gone so quickly. No bus stops, no buildings to duck into, nowhere to hide. The concrete barrier stretched for hundreds of meters in both directions, and I would have seen her if she had walked away along the road. Confused and unsettled, I was about to drive away when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The passenger seat was soaking wet, not just damp, but thoroughly saturated, as if someone had been sitting there in completely soaked clothing for an extended period. The fabric squelched when I pressed it, and water actually dripped onto the floor mat. My radio crackled with static, then cleared to reveal a woman's voice, faint but unmistakably desperate. "Please take me home to my children. Please, I need to see my babies." I fumbled for the radio controls, but the voice faded back into static before I could respond. My hands were shaking as I turned the heater on full blast and drove straight back to the taxi company garage. I spent the rest of the night drying out the passenger seat and trying to convince myself I had imagined the whole thing. But I hadn't imagined it. The wet seat was real. The voice on the radio was real. And 3 nights later, she was there again. This time I was driving eastbound around the same time, 2:30 in the morning. Same location, same white dress, same desperate crying. I slowed down, despite every instinct telling me to keep driving. She looked up at my approaching taxi with that same expression of desperate hope. "Please," she called out, her voice carrying clearly through the night air. "I need to go home. My children are waiting for me." Against my better judgment, I pulled over again. "Where do you live? I'll take you there." She stepped toward the car, reaching for the door handle. This time, I watched more carefully, and I saw it happen. As her hand touched the metal handle, her entire form seemed to dissolve, like mist being blown away by wind. One moment she was there, solid and real. The next moment, there was nothing but empty air. The passenger seat was wet again. The radio crackled with the same pleading voice. "Take me home to my children. Please, I can't find the way." This became a pattern over the following weeks. Every few nights, always around 2:30 a.m., always at the same spot on Route 246. She would be standing there crying. I would stop to help. She would ask to go home to her children, and then she would vanish the moment she tried to get into the taxi. I started asking other drivers about it. Most of them just shrugged and said Route 246 had always been strange at night. But one older driver, Suzuki-san, pulled me aside after I described what I had been seeing. "That sounds like the woman who jumped there about 5 years ago," he said quietly. "Nakamura something. Had a nervous breakdown after her husband left her and took the kids. She was fighting for custody, but the courts were giving her trouble because she had been hospitalized for depression." He showed me a newspaper clipping he kept in his wallet, yellow with age. The headline read, "Mother of 2 dies in Route 246 tragedy." The accompanying photo showed a woman in her 30s with shoulder-length black hair and a sad smile. It was definitely the same face I had been seeing. Nakamura Yuki. Suzuki-san read from the article. Age 34. She had been living in a small apartment in Shibuya after the separation, working part-time jobs and trying to save money for lawyer fees. The night she died, she had just come from a custody hearing that didn't go well. The judge had ruled that she needed to complete more psychological evaluations before she could have overnight visits with her children. The article mentioned that witnesses had seen her standing near the barrier for almost an hour before she jumped, apparently talking on her phone with someone. Her last call had been to her ex-husband, begging him to let her see their children just once more. She's probably still trying to get home to them, Suzuki-san said matter-of-factly. Some spirits get stuck repeating their last desperate wish. The taxi drivers who work this route have been seeing her for years. I asked why nobody had ever called the police or tried to help her find peace, and Suzuki-san just shrugged. What would you tell them? That there's a ghost who wants a taxi ride? Besides, she's not causing any real harm. She's just a mother trying to get home. But that wasn't entirely true. The encounters were affecting me more than I wanted to admit. Every time I saw her, every time I heard her voice on the radio, begging to be taken to her children, I felt a crushing weight of sadness that stayed with me for days. I started having trouble sleeping, plagued by dreams of children crying for their mother who would never come home. My grades began to suffer. I found myself distracted during lectures, thinking about Nakamura-san standing in the rain, crying for her lost children. I started taking different routes to avoid that section of Route 246, but somehow I always ended up there anyway, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't understand. The encounters became more frequent and more intense. Sometimes she would appear not just at the suicide spot, but at other locations along Route 246. Always crying, always asking to go home to her children, always vanishing when she tried to enter the taxi. The passenger seat would be wet. The radio would crackle with her desperate pleas. One night in May, the voice on the radio was different. Instead of begging to be taken home, she was crying out names. Hiroto, Misaki, Mama is coming. Mama is trying to come home. I realized these must be her children's names. The thought of two young children, now probably 9 or 10 years old, who had lost their mother to suicide and custody battles, made the encounters even more heartbreaking. I started researching what had happened to them, but found nothing. Their father had apparently moved away from Tokyo after the tragedy, probably to escape the memories and media attention. The psychological toll became unbearable. I found myself crying while driving, overcome by grief that wasn't entirely my own. My friends and family noticed the change in my behavior. My girlfriend, Tomoko, was particularly worried. "You look like you haven't slept in weeks," she told me. "And you keep talking about some woman you pick up, but then you say she disappears. Kenji, you're scaring me." I tried to explain what was happening, but it sounded crazy even to me. How could I tell her that I was being haunted by the ghost of a woman who had killed herself 5 years ago? A woman whose last wish was to see her children one more time. The breaking point came on a humid night in June. I was driving my usual route when I saw her again, but this time she wasn't alone. Standing beside her were 2 small figures, a boy and a girl, both translucent and shimmering like mirages. They were holding hands with the woman, and all 3 of them were looking directly at my approaching taxi. I pulled over, my heart pounding. This time, instead of asking for a ride home, Nakamura-san smiled sadly and bowed deeply. "Thank you for stopping," she said, her voice clearer than it had ever been. "Thank you for trying to help me get home." "Are those your children?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She nodded, tears still streaming down her face, but her expression was peaceful for the first time. "They came to find me. They came to take me home." The 3 figures began to fade, becoming more and more transparent. As they disappeared, I heard the children's voices, high and sweet. "We love you, Mama. Come home with us now." The radio crackled one final time with Nakamura-san's voice, but instead of desperate pleading, It was filled with joy and relief. "I'm going home now. Thank you for caring." Then they were gone. And the stretch of Route 246 felt different somehow, lighter. The oppressive sadness that had hung over that curve for 5 years seemed to lift like morning mist. I never saw them again after that night. Other drivers confirmed that the sightings have stopped. The passenger seat stays dry, and the radio only picks up normal dispatch calls. But the experience changed me permanently. I think about Nakamura-san and her children often, wondering if they found the peace in death that had been denied to them in life. I also think about the thousands of other people struggling with custody battles, depression, and the crushing weight of trying to be good parents under impossible circumstances. I still drive taxi part-time to pay for university, but now I make a point of being especially kind to passengers who seem distressed or desperate. You never know what someone is going through, what impossible situation has brought them to the point of standing beside a road at 2:30 in the morning, crying for their children. Sometimes, when I drive past that curve on Route 246, I say a small prayer for all the mothers and fathers who are separated from their children, whether by divorce, death, or circumstances beyond their control. I hope they find their way home, one way or another. The passenger seat hasn't been mysteriously wet since that night in June, but I keep a small towel in my glove compartment anyway, just in case someone else needs help getting home. The Backwards Passenger. My name is Yamada Toshio, and I have worked as a dispatcher for Tokyo Metropolitan Taxi Company for 18 years. In that time, I have handled thousands of radio calls from drivers, dealing with everything from drunk passengers to medical emergencies to police incidents. But nothing in my experience prepared me for the reports that started coming in during the autumn of 2023, all concerning the same impossible passenger. It began on a foggy October night, when one of our most reliable drivers, Matsumoto-san, called in just after midnight. His voice was shaking so badly I could barely understand him through the radio static. "Dispatch, this is car number 47. I need someone to come get me. I can't drive anymore tonight." I had never heard Matsumoto-san sound like this. He was a veteran driver with over 20 years on the night shift, the kind of man who could handle any situation with calm professionalism. "What's your location, Matsumoto-san? Are you injured?" "I'm at the intersection of Meiji Dori and Omotesando. Listen, something happened with my last passenger, something that shouldn't be possible." I grabbed my incident report form, thinking this was probably another case of passenger violence or property damage. "Tell me what happened." I picked up an elderly man near Shibuya Station around 11:30. He was wearing a dark suit, very formal, like he was going to a funeral or coming from one. He got in the back seat and gave me an address in Setagaya. So far, this sounded completely normal. Go on. Well, about 10 minutes into the ride, I glanced in my rearview mirror to check on him, and, "Matsumoto?" San's voice trailed off. "And what?" His head was turned completely around, 180 degrees. He was sitting facing forward in the seat, but his head was twisted, so he was looking directly at me through the rearview mirror. His neck was impossible, Yamada-san. No human being could turn their head that far. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I tried to maintain my professional demeanor. "Matsumoto-san, are you sure about what you saw? It was late. Maybe the lighting played tricks on your eyes." "I'm sure." And when he saw me looking, he smiled. Then he started giving me directions, but not to the address he had originally requested. He told me to turn left here, right there. Keep going straight. I was so shocked I just followed his instructions automatically. "Where did he direct you to go?" "To the site of that terrible accident 3 years ago, where the family of 4 died when their car went off the elevated highway. You remember, the Nakayama family." He had me park right at the spot where their car crashed through the barrier. I did remember that accident. It had been front-page news for weeks. The father had apparently fallen asleep at the wheel after working a double shift, and their car had plowed through a safety barrier and fallen 30 meters to the street below. All 4 family members were killed instantly. Then what happened? He paid me the exact fare in old bills, the kind they stopped printing in the 1980s. When I turned around to ask him about it, he was gone, just vanished from the back seat. But the smell. Matsumoto-san made a gagging sound. The whole car reeks of funeral incense, that heavy, sweet smell they use at Buddhist ceremonies for the dead. It's so strong I can barely breathe. I thought Matsumoto-san might be having some kind of breakdown. The night shift can be hard on older drivers, and stress sometimes manifests in strange ways. I arranged for another driver to pick him up and take him home, then filed a standard incident report noting possible fatigue-related hallucinations. But 3 nights later, I got another call. This time, it was Kobayashi-san, a middle-aged driver who worked the business district route. Dispatch, I just had the strangest passenger, an old man in a funeral suit who sat backwards in my car. My blood went cold. Backwards? His body was facing forward, but his head was completely turned around, looking at me through the mirror the whole time. He directed me to that intersection in Shibuya, where the pedestrian was hit by the bus last year. Remember that case? The young mother pushing a baby stroller? I remembered. Another tragic accident that had dominated the news cycle. The driver had been cleared of wrongdoing, but the image of the scene had been burned into the public consciousness. What happened when you arrived? He paid me in old money and disappeared. But my car, it smells like a funeral home now. I can't get the scent out, no matter what I try. Over the following weeks, more drivers reported similar encounters. Always the same description. An elderly man, in a dark formal suit, sitting with his head twisted impossibly backward, directing them to locations where fatal accidents had occurred. Always paying in obsolete currency. Always leaving behind the overwhelming smell of funeral incense. The drivers who experienced these encounters were all veteran professionals, men I had worked with for years. They weren't prone to flights of fancy or supernatural beliefs, but they were all deeply shaken by what they had seen. I started keeping a detailed log of the incidents. The pattern was consistent and disturbing. The passenger always appeared between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. He directed drivers to accident sites throughout Tokyo, but specifically to locations where particularly tragic or violent deaths had occurred. Car crashes, pedestrian accidents, building collapses, fires. Always places where multiple people had died, suddenly and violently. The old currency was always the same denomination and year, matching the exact fare for each journey. I researched the bills and found they had been discontinued in 1983, 40 years before these encounters began. But the most disturbing aspect was the physical effect on the drivers and their vehicles. The smell of funeral incense would permeate the cars so completely that it was impossible to remove. We tried professional cleaning services, air purifiers, even replacing the upholstery. Nothing worked. The affected vehicles eventually had to be taken out of service because passengers would refuse to ride in them. The drivers themselves showed signs of lasting psychological trauma. They complained of insomnia, recurring nightmares about the accident sites they had been directed to, and an overwhelming sense of grief that seemed to have no source. Several requested transfers to day shifts or took extended leave. I decided to investigate the accident sites myself. During my off hours, I visited each location the mysterious passenger had directed our drivers to. What I found made my skin crawl. Every single site had a small roadside shrine, the kind Japanese families erect to commemorate traffic accident victims. The shrines contained offerings of flowers, incense, and small personal items. But what caught my attention was that all the shrines showed signs of recent activity. Fresh incense had been burned, new flowers had been placed, and the small dishes for offerings contained what looked like old coins and bills. At the site of the Nakayama family accident, I met an elderly woman who was tending to the shrine. She introduced herself as Nakayama Fumiko, the grandmother of the 2 children who had died in the crash. I come here every week to pray for their spirits, she told me. My son and daughter-in-law and their beautiful children. They died so suddenly, so violently. I worry their spirits are not at rest. I asked her if she had noticed anything unusual about the shrine recently. There's been an old man coming here at night, she said. I've seen him from my apartment window. He kneels at the shrine for hours, burning incense and leaving offerings. I think he might be someone who knew my family, though I've never met him. What does he look like? Very formal, always wearing a dark suit. He moves strangely, like his body is in pain. I wanted to thank him for his kindness, but whenever I try to approach, he's gone. Similar stories emerged at the other accident sites. An elderly man, in formal clothing, visiting the shrines at night, burning incense, leaving offerings, always disappearing before anyone could speak with him directly. I began to suspect that our mysterious passenger was connected to these shrine visits, but I couldn't understand the connection. Why would someone visit accident shrines and then appear in taxis, directing drivers back to the same locations? The answer came from an unexpected source. One of our oldest drivers, Ishida-san, who had been with the company for over 30 years, pulled me aside after hearing about the incidents. I think I know who your backward passenger is, he said quietly. There used to be a driver who worked for our company in the 70s and 80s. Fujiwara-san. He was obsessed with traffic safety, always talking about accident prevention and responsible driving. What happened to him? He died in 1983, just before they changed the currency design. Heart attack while on duty. But here's the thing. He died at the wheel, and his taxi rolled over. The impact broke his neck so severely that his head was twisted almost completely around. The timing matched the old bills our mysterious passenger had been using. What was he like as a person? Very serious about his job. He used to visit accident sites on his own time, trying to understand what had gone wrong, how the accidents could have been prevented. He believed that if drivers could learn from past tragedies, they could avoid repeating them. Do you think he's trying to continue that work? Ishida-san shrugged. Who knows what the dead want? But if Fujiwara-san's spirit is still around, he would definitely be visiting those shrines, paying respects of victims, and maybe trying to show other drivers what happens when things go wrong. This explanation, supernatural as it was, made a disturbing kind of sense. Our backwards passenger wasn't randomly directing drivers to accident sites. He was conducting a grim form of education, forcing them to confront the reality of what could happen when people died violently on the roads. But understanding the motivation didn't make the encounters any less traumatic for our drivers. The reports continued throughout the winter, always following the same pattern. The backwards passenger would appear, direct a driver to an accident site, pay in obsolete currency, and vanish, leaving behind the overwhelming smell of funeral incense. I consulted with a Buddhist monk at a local temple, asking about rituals for helping earthbound spirits find peace. He suggested that Fujiwara-san's spirit might be bound to his work, unable to rest, because he felt his mission of promoting traffic safety was incomplete. Some spirits become attached to their earthly responsibilities, the monk explained. They continue trying to fulfill their duties even after death, but because they no longer have physical bodies, their efforts often disturb the living. He recommended placing protective amulets in our taxis and performing purification ceremonies at the accident sites, not to banish Fujiwara-san's spirit, but to acknowledge his good intentions while encouraging him to find peace. We tried these measures, but the encounters continued. If anything, they became more frequent as spring approached. The backwards passenger appeared to more drivers, directed them to more accident sites, left behind more old currency, and stronger sense of funeral incense. I realized that Fujiwara-san's spirit might not want to find peace. His mission to prevent traffic accidents through education might be too important to him to abandon, even in death. Perhaps he saw each encounter as an opportunity to remind living drivers about the consequences of carelessness or fatigue behind the wheel. The psychological impact on our drivers has been severe and lasting. Even those who have only heard about the encounters secondhand report feeling more anxious about driving at night, more conscious of the potential for accidents, more aware of the shrines and memorials that mark Tokyo's roads. Some have quit the night shift entirely. Others have requested transfers to routes that don't pass by known accident sites. The company has had to implement counseling services and additional safety training to help drivers cope with the stress. But perhaps that was Fujiwara-san's intention all along. Our drivers are now more careful, more alert, more aware of their mortality and responsibility. Traffic violations among our fleet have decreased dramatically. Response times to emergency calls have improved. In some strange way, the backwards passenger might be making our roads safer. The encounters continue to this day. About once a week, one of our drivers reports picking up an elderly man in a funeral suit whose head is turned completely around. He directs them to accident sites, pays in 40-year-old currency, and vanishes, leaving behind the scent of funeral incense and the memory of his impossible twisted neck. I keep detailed records of every incident, partly for company liability purposes, but mostly because I feel someone should document Fujiwara-san's posthumous work. He was dedicated to traffic safety in life, and apparently that dedication survived death. Sometimes I wonder if I'll encounter him myself. I occasionally drive company vehicles during emergencies, and I often work the night dispatch shift when these incidents occur. Part of me hopes I never see the backwards passenger, but part of me respects what he's trying to do. The roads of Tokyo are dangerous places, full of tired drivers, distracted pedestrians, and mechanical failures that can turn routine journeys into tragedies. If Fujiwara-san's spirit wants to remind us of that fact, even from beyond the grave, maybe we should listen. The scent of funeral incense has become a familiar smell in our garage. It no longer frightens our drivers the way it once did. Instead, it serves as a constant reminder that death is always present on the roads, and that our responsibility to drive safely extends beyond our own lives to encompass everyone we share the streets with. Fujiwara-san may be the backwards passenger now, but he's still teaching traffic safety. And in Tokyo's chaotic traffic, that might be the most important lesson anyone can learn. Apartment 3, Chome Ghost Calls. My name is Tanaka Michiko, and I am one of the few female drivers working the night shift for City Taxi in Tokyo. It's not easy being a woman in this job, especially during the late hours when the streets can be dangerous. But the pay is better than office work, and I need the money to support my elderly mother and my daughter's university tuition. What I'm about to tell you happened over several months in 2024, and it has changed how I think about the city I thought I knew so well. I had been driving nights for about 2 years when the strange calls started coming in. It was always the same pattern. The dispatcher would send me to pick up passengers at an apartment building in Shibuya 3 Chome, always around 2 or 3 in the morning, always requesting transport to an address in the Asakusa district. The first time I received the call, I thought nothing of it. Late-night rides from Shibuya to Asakusa were common enough. Usually people visiting elderly relatives or coming home from late jobs in the entertainment district. The dispatcher gave me the building address and mentioned there would be multiple passengers, a family with children. I arrived at the location expecting to see a typical mid-rise apartment building, the kind that fills Tokyo's residential neighborhoods. Instead, I found myself parked in front of an empty lot surrounded by construction barriers. There was nothing there but bare earth, some scattered concrete foundations, and a few pieces of twisted metal that looked like they might have been part of a building's framework. I called dispatch on my radio. "This is car number 23. I'm at the pickup location in Shibuya, 3 Chome. But there's no building here. Just an empty lot. The dispatcher, Watanabe-san, sounded confused. That's strange. Let me check the address again. There was a pause. Then he came back on. The call came in requesting pickup at apartment building Sakura Heights, 347 Shibuya 3 Chome. Are you sure you're at the right location? I double-checked my GPS. I'm definitely at the right address, but there's no apartment building here. It looks like something was demolished recently. Wait for a few more minutes, Watanabe-san instructed. Maybe the passengers are running late. I sat in my taxi with the engine running, looking at the empty lot. The streetlights cast long shadows across the bare ground, and I noticed that some of the concrete chunks were blackened, as if they had been in a fire. A few withered flowers were scattered around what looked like it might have been the building's entrance, the kind of memorial bouquets people leave at accident sites. After 15 minutes of waiting, my radio crackled to life. But instead of Watanabe-san's voice, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Children calling out in thin, scared voices. Taxi lady, are you there? We need to go to grandmother's house. Please don't leave without us. The voices were coming clearly through my radio, but there was no one around. The empty lot was completely silent except for the distant sound of traffic from the main road. I grabbed my radio handset. Dispatch, are you hearing this? There are children's voices coming through the radio. Hearing what? Watanabe-san replied. I just have normal radio traffic. Are the passengers there yet? The children's voices came through again, clearer this time. We're waiting by the front door. Our mother said a taxi was coming to take us to grandmother's house. We have our overnight bags ready. I looked at the empty lot again, more carefully this time. There was no front door, no building, nothing but bare ground. But as I stared, I thought I could see faint outlines in the dirt, marks that might have indicated where walls and doorways had once stood. My taxi doors suddenly clicked and swung open by themselves. First the passenger doors, then the rear doors. The interior light came on, illuminating empty seats. But I could hear rustling sounds, as if people were climbing in, and the car shifted slightly, as if under the weight of passengers. Thank you for waiting, came a woman's voice through the radio, tired and strained. Please take us to grandmother's house in Asakusa. The children are very excited to see her. My meter clicked on by itself and began running. The doors closed with soft clicks, and I heard what sounded like seatbelts being fastened, children giggling quietly, and a mother shushing them gently. I was terrified, but somehow I found myself putting the car in drive and heading toward Asakusa, following the route my GPS suggested. Throughout the 20-minute journey, I could hear the phantom passengers talking softly in the back seat. The children asked their mother when they would be able to go home, and she kept telling them to be patient, that everything would be all right once they reached grandmother's house. When I arrived at the destination address in Asakusa, I found another empty lot. This one looked like it had been vacant for much longer, with weeds growing through cracked concrete and rusty pieces of building materials scattered around. We're here, I announced, though I felt foolish speaking to empty seats. The doors opened again by themselves, and I heard sounds of movement, bags being gathered, children being helped out of the car. The woman's voice came through the radio one last time. Thank you so much. Please wait here for just a moment. I waited, listening to the radio static and the sound of my own heartbeat. After about 10 minutes, the woman's voice returned, but now it sounded different, sadder and somehow more distant. Grandmother's house is gone too, she said quietly. We have nowhere to go. Please take us back home. The return journey was silent, except for occasional sniffling sounds that might have been children crying. When we arrived back at the empty lot in Shibuya, the doors opened, the phantom passengers got out, and my meter stopped running. The total fare showed exactly what a round trip from Shibuya to Asakusa would cost. I called dispatch to report the incident, but Watanabe-san insisted that no pickup call had been logged for that address. According to his records, I had been sitting idle for over an hour with no fares. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I decided to research the empty lot in Shibuya, 3 Chome. What I found made my hands shake as I read. 3 years earlier, there had been a devastating apartment fire at that exact address. Sakura Heights had been a 6-story building housing 12 families. The fire had started on the 2nd floor due to faulty electrical wiring and spread rapidly through the old building's wooden frame construction. Most residents had escaped, but one family on the 4th floor had been trapped. Hayashi Kenji, age 38, his wife Yumiko, age 35, and their twin children, Hiroshi and Akane, both age 7. The children's bodies had been found in their bedroom, while their parents had died trying to reach them through the smoke-filled hallway. According to the news reports, the family had been planning to visit Yumiko's elderly mother in Asakusa the weekend after the fire. The children had been excited about the trip and had already packed their overnight bags. But that wasn't the end of the tragedy. Yumiko's mother, who lived alone in an old house in Asakusa, had died of a heart attack just days after her daughter's funeral. The shock and grief had been too much for her elderly heart. Her house had been demolished 6 months later to make way for a parking lot. I realized that the phantom passengers in my taxi had been the Hayashi family, still trying to make their planned visit to grandmother's house, unaware that both their home and their destination no longer existed. Over the following months, I received the same call dozens of times, always around 2 or 3 a.m., always a request to take a family from Sakura Heights to the same address in Asakusa. Each time, I would drive to the empty lot. My doors would open by themselves, and I would hear the voices of the Hayashi family climbing into my car. The routine was always the same. The children would chatter excitedly about seeing their grandmother, their mother would remind them to behave, and their father would occasionally mention something about work or the weather. They seemed like a normal, happy family, completely unaware that they were dead. The most heartbreaking part was arriving at the destination in Asakusa and listening to the mother realize that grandmother's house was gone. Every single time, she sounded surprised and devastated, as if discovering this loss for the first time. They would ask me to take them back home. The children would cry quietly during the return journey, and then they would disappear back into the empty lot that had once been their apartment building. Other drivers started experiencing the same thing. The company received reports of ghost calls to the Sakura Heights address, phantom passengers who left no trace except for running meters and the sound of children's voices on the radio. Management initially dismissed these as stress-related hallucinations, but there were too many consistent reports to ignore. We discovered that the phenomenon wasn't limited to our taxi company. Drivers from other services reported identical experiences. Calls to pick up the Hayashi family, phantom passengers asking to be taken to grandmother's house, meters running for trips between 2 empty lots. The psychological impact on the drivers was severe. Several requested transfers to day shifts, unable to handle the repeated encounters with the dead family. Those of us who continued working nights developed our own coping strategies. We would carry small offerings, flowers or candy, to leave at the empty lots. We learned to speak gently to the phantom passengers, to treat them with the respect and kindness we would show any living family. I began to research the spiritual aspects of what we were experiencing. I consulted with a Buddhist monk at a nearby temple, who explained that traumatic deaths could bind spirits to their earthly routines, especially when those routines involved strong emotional desires, like visiting loved ones. The family is trapped in a loop, he told me. They died before completing something very important to them, visiting the grandmother. Their spirits continue to attempt this journey, but because both locations no longer exist in the physical world, they can never find peace. He suggested that the empty lots be properly blessed and that memorial services be held for the Hayashi family. But he also warned that such interventions might not work if the spirits were too strongly attached to their unfinished business. The taxi company eventually posted informal warnings about the Sakura Heights calls, instructing drivers to politely accept the phantom fares and treat the dead family with respect. We learned that fighting the experience, or trying to avoid it, only made the encounters more distressing. I still receive the calls regularly. Maybe once or twice a week, the dispatcher sends me to pick up the Hayashi family, even though officially no such calls are logged in the system. I drive to the empty lot, let the phantom passengers into my car, take them to where grandmother's house used to be, listen to their heartbreak when they find only vacant land, and drive them back to their own empty lot. The routine has become almost comforting in its predictability. I know that every few nights, I'll spend an hour helping a dead family try to visit a grandmother who is also dead, traveling between two locations that no longer exist. The futility of it breaks my heart every time, but I feel honored that they trust me with their journey. Other drivers have reported that the phantom passengers sometimes leave small gifts, children's drawings that fade by morning, origami flowers that crumble to dust, or coins that turn out to be play money from old board games. These tokens suggest that the Hayashi family is grateful for our help, even if we cannot truly solve their problem. I have learned to think of myself not just as a taxi driver, but as a ferryman for the dead, helping lost spirits navigate a city that has changed beyond their recognition. The Hayashi family will probably continue making their impossible journey for years to come, and drivers like me will keep answering their calls. Sometimes I dream about them reaching grandmother's house and finding her waiting with arms open wide, finally able to complete their planned visit in whatever realm exists beyond our physical world. But until that day comes, if it ever does, I will keep my taxi ready for their ghost calls, ensuring that even in death, this loving family doesn't have to travel alone. The empty lots in Shibuya and Asakusa stand as silent monuments to love that transcends death, and every night, drivers throughout Tokyo help prove that some bonds are too strong for fire, time, or the grave to break. The hospital run at midnight. My name is Watanabe Takeshi, and I have been driving taxi in Tokyo's medical district for 15 years. The area around Tokyo General Hospital is always busy, even during the night shift. Doctors ending late surgeries, nurses changing shifts, worried family members visiting patients, ambulances arriving with emergencies. You learn to navigate the controlled chaos of a major hospital complex, and you develop a respect for the life and death situations that happen there every day. What I'm about to tell you started in the winter of 2023 and has continued almost every night since then. It has changed how I think about my job, about the hospital, and about the thin line between life and death that runs through every street in this city. It was just past midnight on a cold December evening when I first saw her. I was parked in the taxi queue outside the hospital's main entrance, waiting for fares from the late shift change. The hospital at midnight has a different feeling than during the day. The bright fluorescent lights create harsh shadows, and there's an urgency in the air that comes from knowing that some patients inside are fighting for their lives. She appeared suddenly at my passenger door, a young woman in her 20s with disheveled hair and clothes that looked like she had dressed hastily. She was clutching a bundle, wrapped in a small blanket, holding it against her chest with desperate protectiveness. She knocked on my window with her free hand, and I could see panic in her eyes even through the glass. I rolled down the window and she immediately started speaking, her words tumbling over each other in her urgency. "Please, I need to get to the emergency room immediately. My baby, he's not breathing properly. I called an ambulance, but they said it would take too long. Please, can you drive fast?" I unlocked the doors and she climbed into the back seat, still clutching her bundle. "Don't worry," I told her, pulling away from the curb. "The emergency entrance is just around the building. We'll be there in 2 minutes." As I drove around the hospital complex toward the emergency department, I kept glancing in the rear-view mirror. The woman was rocking back and forth slightly, murmuring to the baby in soft, desperate tones. "It's going to be okay, little one. Mama's getting you help. The doctors will make you better." But something felt strange about the scene. The bundle she was holding seemed unusually still and quiet. Most sick babies cry or fuss, but this one made no sound at all. And there was an odd quality to the woman's voice, as if it was coming from far away. When we reached the emergency entrance, I expected her to jump out quickly and rush inside with her baby. Instead, she sat in the back seat for a moment, looking confused. "This isn't right," she said quietly. "Where is the emergency room?" I looked at where we had stopped. We were at the back of the hospital complex, near the service entrance that led to the morgue. I had somehow driven to the wrong part of the building, though I could have sworn I was following my usual route to the emergency department. "I'm sorry. I must have taken a wrong turn," I said, starting to reverse the car. But when I looked in the rearview mirror again, the back seat was empty. The woman and her baby had vanished completely. The doors hadn't opened, there had been no sound of movement, but they were simply gone. I turned around to look directly at the back seat, thinking maybe they had somehow ducked down, but there was no one there. My hands were shaking as I drove back to the taxi queue. I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe I had dozed off for a moment and dreamed the whole thing. Maybe the stress of working nights was affecting my perception. But the encounter had felt completely real. 3 nights later, it happened again. Same time, just after midnight. Same woman, same desperate urgency, same bundle clutched to her chest. This time, I paid closer attention to our route as I drove toward the emergency entrance. Despite my intention to go directly to the emergency room, my car seemed to steer itself toward the morgue entrance. I tried to correct course, but it was as if the steering wheel had a will of its own. We ended up at the same service entrance at the back of the hospital. Again, the woman looked confused and said, "This isn't right." Again, she and her baby disappeared from the back seat without explanation. This pattern continued every few nights throughout the winter and into spring. Always the same frantic pickup. Always the same desperate plea to get to the emergency room quickly. Always the same wrong destination. Always the same mysterious disappearance. I began to realize that no matter what I tried, I could not get this woman and her baby to the emergency room. Some force seemed to be directing us to the morgue entrance instead. The woman never seemed to remember our previous encounters, treating each ride as if it were the first time she had ever seen me. By the 4th or 5th encounter, I started trying to communicate with her during the ride, asking questions about her baby's condition or her name, but she would only speak to the bundle in her arms, never directly to me. It was as if I was invisible to her, just a means of transportation rather than another human being. The psychological impact of these encounters was severe. I found myself dreading the midnight hour, knowing that she might appear at any moment, but I also felt compelled to help her, even though I couldn't understand why our attempts always ended in failure. I decided to research the history of the hospital, particularly any incidents involving mothers and babies. What I found in the newspaper archives from 2003 made my blood run cold. 20 years earlier, a young mother named Suzuki Yuki had called a taxi to rush her infant son to Tokyo General Hospital's emergency room. The baby had developed breathing difficulties in the middle of the night, and she was unable to reach emergency services. The taxi driver, trying to get to the hospital as quickly as possible, had run a red light at a major intersection. Their taxi was struck by a drunk driver speeding through the intersection. Both the mother and her 6-month-old son were killed instantly. The accident had occurred at exactly 12:15 a.m., just a few blocks from the hospital. According to the news reports, Suzuki Yuki had been a single mother, working 2 jobs to support herself and her baby. The child had been born prematurely and had ongoing health problems that required frequent hospital visits. On the night they died, she had noticed the baby having difficulty breathing and had panicked, calling a taxi because she didn't own a car and couldn't afford ambulance fees. The newspaper included a photograph of Suzuki Yuki. It was definitely the same woman I had been picking up night after night. I realized that what I was experiencing was not just a random haunting, but a reenactment of the last desperate journey of a mother trying to save her child's life. Suzuki-san's spirit was trapped in those final moments, endlessly attempting to reach the emergency room that she never made it to in life. But why was I always being directed to the morgue instead of the emergency entrance? I thought about this puzzle for days until the horrible logic became clear. Suzuki-san and her baby had died instantly in the taxi accident. By the time any vehicle arrived at the hospital that night, they would have been taken directly to the morgue, not the emergency room. My taxi was completing their journey, but not to the place they had hoped to reach. We were going to their actual destination, the place where their bodies had ended up after the accident. Understanding the situation didn't make the encounters any less disturbing. If anything, knowing the tragic backstory made each ride more emotionally devastating. I would sit in the front seat, listening to Suzuki-san whisper desperately to her dead baby, promising him that everything would be okay, that the doctors would help him, completely unaware that they were both already gone. I consulted with a Buddhist monk at a nearby temple about what I should do. He explained that some spirits become trapped in loops of their final traumatic moments, especially when those moments involved intense emotions like maternal love and desperation. The mother's spirit is trying to complete an impossible task, he told me. She died believing she could still save her child, and that belief has bound her to keep trying. But because the child was already dying when she called the taxi, and because they both died in the accident, there is no way for her mission to succeed. He suggested that I try speaking to her during our rides, gently explaining what had happened and encouraging her to let go of her desperate mission. But when I tried this approach, she couldn't hear me. She was completely focused on her baby and on reaching the emergency room. The encounters continued throughout 2024, becoming a regular part of my work routine. Other drivers working the hospital area reported similar experiences, always involving the same woman and baby, always ending at the morgue entrance. The hospital staff became aware of the reports and quietly acknowledged that they had their own supernatural encounters. Night shift workers occasionally saw a young woman with a baby wandering the corridors, looking lost and confused, asking for directions to the emergency room. Security cameras sometimes captured mysterious figures in empty hallways, though the images were always too blurry to make out details. The most unsettling discovery came when I learned that the intersection where Suzuki-san and her baby had died was still a site of frequent accidents. Despite improved traffic signals and safety measures, crashes continued to occur there at an alarming rate, particularly during late-night hours. Local residents reported seeing the ghost of a taxi at the intersection just before accidents happened, as if the original crash was replaying itself over and over. I began to understand that the entire area around the hospital was affected by this tragedy. Suzuki-san's desperate final journey had created a kind of spiritual contamination that continued to influence events 20 years later. Her love for her child and her determination to save him had been so strong that it had imprinted itself on the physical location. The psychological toll of these regular encounters with the dead mother and child has been enormous. I find myself thinking about them during my off hours, wondering if there's anything I can do to help them find peace. I've started leaving small offerings at the accident site, flowers and toys for the baby, hoping that somehow they might feel remembered and honored. But the rides continue. Every few nights, usually around midnight, Suzuki-san appears at my taxi door with her bundled baby, pleading with me to rush them to the emergency room. I drive her to the morgue entrance. She disappears, and I return to the taxi queue knowing that in a few days, we'll repeat the same impossible journey. I've considered requesting a transfer to a different part of the city, but I realize that Suzuki-san needs drivers like me. We are the only ones who can help her attempt her endless mission, even though we know it can never succeed. In some strange way, Providing this service has become a form of memorial, a way of honoring a mother's love that was so strong it survived death. The other drivers who experience these encounters have formed an informal support group. We share our stories, discuss our emotional reactions, and help each other cope with the weight of serving as witnesses to this eternal tragedy. We've learned to think of ourselves not just as taxi drivers, but as guardians of Suzuki-san's memory. Sometimes I imagine what might have happened if that drunk driver hadn't run the red light 20 years ago. Suzuki-san would have reached the emergency room, the doctors would have treated her baby, and both of them would have gone home safely. The child would be 20 years old now, probably a university student, with no memory of that frightening night when he couldn't breathe properly. Instead, they are trapped forever in those final desperate minutes, a mother's love transformed into an endless loop of hope and disappointment. And drivers like me are caught in that loop with them, helping them attempt the same impossible rescue night after night. The hospital at midnight will never look the same to me. Every time I see the bright emergency room entrance, I think about the morgue entrance around back, where Suzuki-san's journey always ends. Every mother I pick up with a sick child reminds me of the one mother I can never successfully help reach the doctors who might save her baby. But I keep my taxi ready for her ghost calls, ensuring that even in death, this loving mother doesn't have to face her impossible mission alone. The Salaryman's Final Commute. My name is Ito Masahiro, and I have been driving taxi in Tokyo's Marunouchi business district for 12 years. The area is filled with corporate headquarters, government offices, and the kind of glass towers where Japan's economic decisions are made. I know the rhythm of this district better than most people know their own neighborhoods. The morning rush of dark suits heading to work, the lunch crowd seeking brief escapes, and the late-night exodus of exhausted workers finally heading home. It's the late-night pickups that taught me the most about the real cost of Japan's work culture. I've driven salarymen who hadn't seen their families in weeks, women breaking down from impossible deadlines, and middle managers carrying the weight of decisions that could destroy careers. But nothing prepared me for the passenger I started encountering in the autumn of 2023, a man whose despair was so profound it seemed to contaminate everything around him. The first time I picked him up was on a Friday night in October, just past 11 p.m. I was parked outside the Mitsubishi building when a man in his 40s approached my taxi. He wore a rumpled dark suit that had probably looked sharp 12 hours earlier, and his tie was loosened but still properly knotted. What struck me immediately was his posture, shoulders curved inward, like he was trying to make himself smaller, and a way of walking that suggested enormous fatigue. He got into the back seat without making eye contact, and gave me an address in Setagaya Ward, a residential area about 30 minutes away. As soon as he settled into the seat, I felt something change in the taxi's atmosphere. The air seemed heavier, more oppressive, as if the weight of his exhaustion was physically pressing down on the interior of the car. During the drive, he never stopped checking his phone. Every few seconds, he would look at the screen with desperate intensity, scrolling through what appeared to be work emails. His fingers moved frantically across the screen, but he never seemed to type any responses, just endless checking, scrolling, waiting for something that never came. "Working late tonight?" I asked, trying to make conversation. He didn't respond. He was completely absorbed in his phone, occasionally making small, frustrated sounds as he read whatever was displayed there. The light from his screen cast harsh shadows on his face, emphasizing the dark circles under his eyes and the way his cheeks had hollowed out from stress and poor eating habits. About halfway through the journey, I noticed something disturbing. The oppressive feeling in the taxi had intensified to the point where I was having difficulty breathing properly. My chest felt tight, and I was beginning to experience what I can only describe as a crushing sense of hopelessness that wasn't my own. It was as if his emotional state was somehow infecting the physical space around us. When we arrived at the address in Setagaya, I expected him to get out and head to whatever apartment building or house was his destination. Instead, he directed me to continue to a small park a few blocks away. The park was dark and empty, with a single streetlight illuminating a bench near a pond. "Please wait here for a moment," he said, speaking for the first time since giving me the initial address. His voice was flat and emotionless, completely drained of any vitality. He got out of the taxi and walked toward the bench by the pond, still clutching his phone. I watched him sit down and continue checking his emails, the glow from his screen the only light in that corner of the park. After about 10 minutes, he returned to the taxi. "Back to the office, please," he said. I was confused. "It's almost midnight. Are you sure you want to go back to work?" "I have to check something," he replied, returning his attention to his phone. The return journey was even more oppressive than the outbound trip. The weight of despair in the taxi had become almost unbearable. I found myself thinking about my own work failures, my financial struggles, the ways I had disappointed my family. These weren't my usual thoughts, but they felt overwhelming and inescapable while this passenger was in my car. When we arrived back at the Mitsubishi building, he paid the exact fare and walked toward the entrance, still checking his phone. I watched him disappear into the building's lobby, then spent the next 20 minutes sitting in my taxi, trying to shake off the profound depression that had settled over me during our rides. The next Friday night, at exactly the same time, the same man appeared at my taxi. Same rumpled suit, same exhausted posture, same desperate phone-checking behavior. He gave me the same address in Setagaya, and we repeated the entire journey: residential area, park bench by the pond, return trip to the office. This pattern continued for weeks. Every Friday at 11 p.m., the exhausted salary man would get into my taxi, obsessively check his phone during our trips to Setagaya, sit on the park bench for 10 minutes, then return to his office building. And every time, the oppressive atmosphere in my taxi would become more intense. The psychological impact on me was severe. After each encounter, I would spend days feeling depressed and anxious, plagued by thoughts of professional failure and worthlessness. Other passengers who rode in my taxi during the days following these Friday night trips would comment on how uncomfortable the car felt, how they experienced sudden feelings of sadness or panic while riding with me. I started researching the park in Setagaya, where my mysterious passenger always asked to stop. What I discovered explained everything and made the encounters infinitely more tragic. 2 years earlier, in October of 2021, a salaryman named Nakamura Hiroshi had been found dead on the bench by the pond. He had taken his own life after months of escalating work pressure at his job with a major trading company. According to news reports, Nakamura-san had been working 18-hour days, trying to meet impossible deadlines, and his manager had been threatening termination if certain projects weren't completed on schedule. The article mentioned that Nakamura-san had been found with his work phone in his hand, still displaying emails he had been trying to respond to, even in his final moments. Co-workers reported that he had become obsessed with checking his messages, constantly worried that missing a single email might cost him his job. The photograph in the newspaper showed a man in his 40s wearing a dark business suit. It was definitely the same person who had been riding in my taxi every Friday night. I realized that what I was experiencing was not a living passenger, but the ghost of Nakamura Hiroshi, eternally repeating his final commute from work to the place where he had ended his life. He was trapped in a loop of the overwhelming work stress that had driven him to desperation, still checking for emails that would never come, still trying to meet deadlines that no longer mattered. But understanding the situation didn't make the encounters any less disturbing. If anything, knowing the tragic backstory made each Friday night ride more emotionally devastating. I was witnessing the final journey of a man who had been crushed by Japan's demanding work culture, someone who had literally worked himself to death. The oppressive atmosphere that filled my taxi during these rides wasn't just supernatural phenomena. It was the accumulated weight of Nakamura-san's final months, the impossible pressure, the constant anxiety, the growing certainty that no matter how hard he worked, it would never be enough. His despair was so profound that it had somehow imprinted itself on the physical world, contaminating any space he occupied. I consulted with a Buddhist monk about how to handle the situation. He explained that some spirits become trapped by their final obsessions, particularly when those obsessions involve unfinished work or unfulfilled obligations. This man died believing his work was more important than his life, the monk told me. His spirit continues trying to complete tasks that can never be finished, to satisfy managers who are no longer there, to meet standards that destroyed him. He is caught in the worst kind of spiritual prison. The monk suggested that I try speaking to Nakamura-san during our rides, gently encouraging him to let go of his work obligations and find peace. But when I attempted this, he couldn't hear me. He was completely absorbed in his phone, frantically checking for messages that represented his worth as an employee and as a person. The encounters continued throughout the winter and into spring. Every Friday night, Nakamura-san's ghost would appear at my taxi, and I would drive him through his eternal commute from office to death site and back again. The psychological contamination became so severe that I had to take breaks from work after each encounter, spending days recovering from the depression and anxiety that his presence left behind. Other drivers working the business district began reporting similar experiences. Always the same exhausted salaryman, always the same route to Setagaya, always the same oppressive atmosphere that made passengers physically uncomfortable for weeks afterward. The phenomenon wasn't limited to my taxi. The most disturbing aspect was how Nakamura-san's spiritual contamination seemed to be affecting living people in ways that mirrored his own final crisis. Passengers who rode in taxis after his ghost encounters reported increased work anxiety, obsessive email checking, and feelings of professional inadequacy that persisted long after their rides ended. I began to understand that Nakamura-san's spirit wasn't just trapped in his own suffering, but was unknowingly spreading the toxic work culture that had killed him. His ghost was infecting others with the same destructive patterns that had led to his death. The business district where I work is full of people pushing themselves to dangerous extremes, sacrificing their health and relationships for corporate success. Nakamura-san's spirit was like a concentrated dose of everything wrong with Japan's work culture, a supernatural manifestation of the pressure that destroys so many lives. I started carrying protective amulets in my taxi and burning purifying incense after each encounter. But these measures could only limit the contamination, not eliminate it. Nakamura-san's despair was too profound, his final obsession too complete, for traditional spiritual remedies to fully counteract. The Friday night rides continue to this day. Nakamura-san appears at my taxi door, gets in without speaking, checks his phone obsessively during our journey to the park where he died, sits on the bench for exactly 10 minutes, then returns to his office building. The pattern never varies, and he never seems to realize that he's dead. The psychological toll on me and other drivers has been enormous. We've formed an informal support group, meeting regularly to discuss our experiences and help each other cope with the spiritual contamination. Several drivers have requested transfers away from the business district, unable to handle the repeated exposure to such concentrated despair. But I continue working this route, partly because I need the income, and partly because I feel someone should witness Nakamura-san's eternal suffering. His death was not just a personal tragedy, but a symptom of systemic problems in Japanese society. His ghost serves as a reminder of what happens when work becomes more important than life itself. Sometimes I wonder if Nakamura-san's spirit will ever find peace, or if he's destined to repeat his final commute forever. The work culture that killed him hasn't changed. If anything, it has become more demanding, more ruthless, more willing to sacrifice human well-being for corporate profits. Every Friday night, when I see his familiar figure approaching my taxi, I'm reminded that the horror isn't just supernatural. The real horror is a society that drives people to the point where death seems preferable to another day of impossible demands and endless disappointment. Nakamura, San's ghost, continues his final commute, checking emails that will never be answered, trying to meet deadlines that no longer exist, carrying the weight of work pressure that has become heavier than life itself. And taxi drivers like me continue to serve as witnesses to this ongoing tragedy, forever marked by our encounters with the spirit of a man who literally worked himself to death. The Schoolgirl's Eternal Return. My name is Yamada Hiroshi, and I have been driving taxi in Tokyo for 38 years. At 67 years old, I am one of the oldest drivers still working the evening shift. But I continue because I need the income to support my wife's medical expenses and because, honestly, I don't know what else I would do with myself. The streets of Tokyo have changed dramatically over the decades I've been working them, but some things remain constant. People need to get from one place to another, and someone has to help them do it. What I'm about to tell you began in the spring of 2024 and has continued almost every evening since then. It involves a passenger who should not exist, a journey that always ends in the same terrible place, and evidence that has convinced me that some tragedies are too profound to be contained by death. It was a warm April evening when I first saw her. I was parked near Kichijoji Station around 6 p.m., during the time when students are heading home from their after-school activities and cram schools. She appeared at my passenger door like any other high school student. Navy blue uniform, knee-high socks, heavy school bag slung over her shoulder. She looked to be about 16 or 17 years old, with shoulder-length black hair and the kind of serious expression that many students wear when they're focused on their studies. She got into the back seat and gave me an address in a residential neighborhood about 15 minutes away. Her voice was polite and clear, using the proper respectful language that well-brought-up students are taught to use with adults. Nothing about the interaction seemed unusual at first. "Thank you for the ride," she said, as I pulled away from the station. "I need to get home to continue studying." As we drove through the evening traffic, I noticed that she had taken a notebook and vocabulary cards from her school bag and was quietly reviewing them. This wasn't uncommon. Many students use taxi rides as study time, especially during exam season. But there was something particularly intense about her concentration, as if these study materials were the most important things in the world. "English vocabulary," she explained when she noticed me glancing in the rearview mirror. "I'm preparing for university entrance exams. I need to memorize 200 new words this week." I smiled, remembering my own daughter at that age, staying up late to study for exams. "Which university are you hoping to attend?" "Waseda University," she replied without looking up from her cards. "I want to study international relations. My dream is to work for the United Nations someday and help people around the world." Her dedication was admirable, and I found myself feeling proud of this unknown student's ambition. During the 15-minute drive, she never stopped reviewing her vocabulary cards, occasionally muttering English words under her breath as she memorized their meanings. When we arrived at the address she had given me, I was surprised to find that it led to an empty lot surrounded by a construction fence. There was no house there, just bare ground and some scattered building materials. "Excuse me," I said, turning around to speak to her. "I think there might be some mistake with the address. There's no house here." But the back seat was empty. She had vanished without any sound of the door opening or closing. Her school bag was gone too. But lying on the seat where she had been sitting was a single vocabulary card with the English word "help" written on one side and its Japanese translation on the other. I picked up the card with shaking hands. The paper felt strangely cold, and the handwriting looked urgent, as if it had been written quickly under stress. I sat in my taxi for several minutes, trying to understand what had just happened, before finally driving back to the station area. 3 days later, she was there again. Same uniform, same serious expression, same heavy school bag. She got into my taxi and gave me the same address, and during the ride, she reviewed the same English vocabulary cards with the same intense concentration. "I'm preparing for university entrance exams," she told me again, as if we had never met before. "I want to study international relations and work for the United Nations." This time, I paid closer attention to her studying materials. The vocabulary cards were worn and creased, as if they had been handled thousands of times. Her notebook was filled with meticulously written English words and their definitions, along with practice sentences. But as we drove, I noticed something disturbing. Interspersed with the vocabulary words were handwritten pleas for help. "Someone is following me home from school. Read one entry between definitions of democracy and economics." Another note, squeezed into the margin next to a list of irregular verbs, said, "He waits for me near the station every day." A third, written in increasingly frantic handwriting, pleaded, "I'm scared to walk home alone, but I can't tell my parents because they'll worry." When we arrived at the empty lot, she disappeared again, leaving behind another vocabulary card. This one had "afraid" written in English on one side, but when I turned it over, instead of a Japanese translation, there was a desperate message. "He's been watching me for weeks. I think he knows where I live." Over the following months, this became a regular occurrence. Every few days, the same high school girl would get into my taxi near Kichijoji Station, review her English vocabulary during our drive to the empty lot, and vanish upon arrival, leaving behind evidence of her fear and desperation. Each vocabulary card she left behind told part of a horrifying story. Stalker was paired with, "A man follows me home from cram school." Danger was matched with, "He tried to talk to me yesterday, but I ran away." Police corresponded to, "Should I tell someone? But what if they don't believe me?" The notebook pages I occasionally found told an even more detailed tale of escalating harassment. The girl, whose name I learned from her notebook was Sato Yuki, had been stalked by an older man for months. He would wait for her near the train station, follow her to cram school, and somehow had learned her home address. Her vocabulary study was interspersed with increasingly frantic accounts of his behavior. "He left a letter in my school bag. Read one entry. He says he loves me and wants to protect me forever." Another note described how, "He was waiting outside my house last night. I saw him from my bedroom window." Most heartbreaking were her attempts to convince herself that the situation would resolve itself. "Maybe if I ignore him, he'll lose interest." She had written next to a list of words related to international diplomacy. "I just need to focus on my studies, and everything will be okay." I began researching missing persons cases and news reports from the area around Kichijoji Station. What I found confirmed my growing fears. 2 years earlier, in April of 2022, 16-year-old Sato Yuki had been murdered by a stalker while walking home from evening cram school. According to news reports, she had been followed and harassed by a 28-year-old man named Ishida Kenji for several months before the attack. Despite the escalating harassment, she had never reported the stalking to police or told her parents about the danger she was facing. She had been found dead in the yard of an abandoned house that was being prepared for demolition, the same location where I always dropped her off. The news articles mentioned that she had been carrying English vocabulary cards when she was found, still preparing for entrance exams she would never take. Her dream of studying international relations at Waseda University and working for the United Nations had died with her. Understanding the tragic backstory made my continued encounters with Yuki's spirit even more heartbreaking. She was trapped in her final months of life, endlessly reviewing vocabulary for exams that no longer mattered, traveling repeatedly to the place where her dreams had been violently ended. The vocabulary cards she left behind became increasingly desperate as the months passed. Words like rescue, escape, and survival appeared alongside pleas for help that grew more frantic with each encounter. "He's getting bolder," read one card. "I think he's planning something terrible." Most disturbing was a notebook page I found that contained what appeared to be a letter she had never been able to send. "Dear Mother and Father, I should have told you about the man who has been following me. I was afraid you would worry or make me stop going to cram school. I thought I could handle it myself. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to ask for help when I still had time." The psychological impact of these regular encounters has been profound. Every time I see a young woman in school uniform near the station, I worry about her safety. Every time I hear about stalking cases in the news, I think about Yuki's desperate attempts to study her way to a better future while living in fear. I've tried to research what happened to her stalker, but information about the case is limited. Ishida Kenji was arrested, convicted, and imprisoned, but that justice came too late to save Yuki or restore her stolen dreams. The most tragic aspect of these encounters is witnessing Yuki's eternal optimism about her future, even as she documented her growing terror in the margins of her study materials. She never stopped believing that if she just worked hard enough, studied enough vocabulary, passed her entrance exams, she could escape to a better life. She died, still clutching the English words that represented her hopes for the future. I continue to pick up Yuki's spirit every few evenings, driving her from Kichijoji Station, empty lot, where her body was found. The vocabulary cards she leaves behind have become a kind of memorial, evidence of a bright young woman who deserved the chance to achieve her dreams. Sometimes I wonder if she knows she's dead, or if she's still preparing for entrance exams in whatever realm spirits inhabit. Her dedication to her studies never wavers, even in death. She continues reviewing the same English words, preparing for a test she'll never take, holding on to dreams that can never be fulfilled. The empty lot where I drop her off has been developed now, replaced by a small apartment building. But Yuki's spirit still directs me to the same address, still disappears at the same spot where her life ended. The new residents of the building sometimes report strange occurrences. The sound of someone studying late at night, English words whispered in empty rooms, and notebooks that appear and disappear without explanation. I've considered reporting my experiences to the police or to Yuki's family, but what would I tell them? That their daughter's ghost rides in my taxi every few days? Still trying to study for exams 2 years after her murder? That she's trapped forever in the months leading up to her death, reviewing vocabulary for dreams that died with her? Instead, I keep the vocabulary cards she leaves behind, preserving them as evidence of her dedication and her terror. Each card represents not just an English word she was trying to memorize, but a moment in the final chapter of a life that was cut tragically short. The cards have taught me English words I never knew before, but they've also taught me more important lessons about the vulnerability of young people and the importance of speaking up about danger. Yuki died because she was too polite, too worried about troubling others, too convinced that she could handle her problems alone. Every evening, when I work near Kichijoji Station, I watch for young women walking alone, especially students carrying heavy bags filled with dreams and ambitions. I offer discounted rides to those who seem nervous or afraid, and I encourage them to trust their instincts about potential danger. Yuki's eternal return to my taxi has transformed me from just a driver into a guardian of sorts. Someone who understands that the real horror isn't supernatural phenomena, but the violence that destroys innocent lives and steals futures that should have been bright with possibility. Her vocabulary cards continue to appear in my taxi, each one a whispered plea for help that came too late, each one a reminder that some dreams are too precious to die, even when the dreamer has been silenced forever. The Wedding Dress Passenger. My name is Tanaka Keisuke, and I have been driving taxi in Tokyo's Temple District for 22 years. My route covers the area around Meiji Shrine, Yasukuni Shrine, and dozens of smaller temples and shrines scattered throughout the neighborhoods of Shibuya and Shinjuku. It's beautiful work in many ways, serving people during some of the most important moments of their lives: weddings, coming-of-age ceremonies, prayers for newborn babies, memorial services for the deceased. The Temple District has its own rhythm, different from the business areas or residential neighborhoods. There's a reverence here, a sense that the spiritual world exists alongside the everyday world of concrete and steel. People dress more formally, speak more quietly, move with greater purpose. Even tourists seem to understand that they're in sacred space. What I'm about to tell you began in the summer of 2024 and has continued with increasing frequency since then. It involves a passenger who appears near various shrines, always wearing traditional wedding attire, always seeking transport to a ceremony that ended in unimaginable tragedy decades ago. The first time I saw her was on a humid evening in July. I was parked near the entrance to a small Shinto shrine in Harajuku, waiting for the evening ceremonies to end so I could pick up worshippers heading home. Around 8 p.m., as the last visitors were leaving the shrine grounds, I noticed a figure in white moving slowly along the tree-lined path. She was wearing a traditional white wedding kimono, the formal shiromuku style reserved for the most sacred part of Shinto wedding ceremonies. The silk gleamed in the lamplight, and her hair was arranged in the elaborate traditional style with ornamental combs and pins. Everything about her appearance was perfect, from the white tabi socks to the delicate makeup that emphasized her youth and purity. She approached my taxi with the measured, graceful steps that brides are taught for their wedding processions. When she reached the passenger door, she bowed formally before speaking. "Excuse me, driver-san. I need to go to the Hachiman Shrine in Kamakura for my wedding ceremony. It's very important that I arrive on time." Her voice was soft and polite, filled with the kind of nervous excitement that brides often display on their wedding day. I glanced at my watch. It was past 8 p.m., and Kamakura was over an hour away. Most wedding ceremonies would have been completed hours earlier. "Are you sure about the time?" I asked gently. "It's quite late for a wedding ceremony." She looked confused for a moment, then smiled. "Oh, it's an evening ceremony. My future husband's family has very specific traditions they want to follow." I helped her into the back seat, being careful not to disturb the elaborate folds of her kimono. As soon as she settled into the seat, I noticed something strange about the atmosphere in the taxi. The air seemed to grow heavy and oppressive, filled with an emotion I couldn't immediately identify, something between anticipation and dread. During the drive to Kamakura, she spoke about her upcoming marriage with a mixture of joy and anxiety that seemed normal for a bride. She mentioned that she was marrying into a wealthy family, that the wedding would secure her family's financial future, and that she hoped to make her parents proud. "I've never met most of his relatives," she confided, "but his mother assured me that they will welcome me warmly once I prove myself worthy of their family name." There was something in her voice that made me uneasy. The way she spoke about proving herself worthy suggested that her acceptance into the family was conditional, contingent on more than just the marriage ceremony itself. As we approached Kamakura, the oppressive feeling in the taxi intensified. I began to experience emotions that weren't my own: a crushing sense of betrayal, rage at broken promises, and a despair so profound it made my hands shake on the steering wheel. These feelings seemed to be emanating from my passenger, though she continued speaking cheerfully about her wedding plans. When we arrived at Hachiman Shrine, I expected to see signs of a wedding celebration: lanterns, guests, ceremonial decorations. Instead, the shrine grounds were dark and empty, except for a few maintenance workers closing up for the night. "This doesn't look like there's a wedding happening," I observed. My passenger looked out the window with growing confusion. "That's strange. They said it would be here." Maybe they moved it to a different location? She asked me to wait while she checked with the shrine attendants. I watched her graceful figure disappear into the shadows near the main shrine building. After about 15 minutes, she returned to the taxi, but her demeanor had changed completely. The nervous excitement was gone, replaced by a hollow, devastated expression. "There's no wedding," she said quietly. There never was going to be a wedding. Before I could ask what she meant, she vanished from the back seat. One moment she was there in her beautiful white kimono, the next moment the seat was empty. But the emotional atmosphere she had brought with her lingered in the taxi, filling me with her betrayal and heartbreak. I drove home that night feeling profoundly disturbed, not just by the supernatural disappearance, but by the intensity of grief and betrayal that had filled my taxi. Over the following days, I found myself unable to shake the feeling that I had been deeply wronged by someone I loved and trusted, even though nothing in my own life justified such emotions. The second encounter happened 3 weeks later, near a different shrine in Shibuya. The same bride, in the same white kimono, asking to be taken to the same wedding ceremony that didn't exist. This time, during our journey, she told me more details about her situation. "My family has financial difficulties," she explained. "My marriage will bring a substantial dowry from his family, enough to save my father's business and secure my younger siblings' futures. I know it's not a love match, but sometimes duty is more important than personal happiness." The way she spoke about duty and sacrifice resonated with traditional Japanese values, but there was something deeply troubling about the arrangement she described. The more she talked, the more it sounded less like a marriage and more like a financial transaction. When we arrived at the empty shrine grounds, and she realized again that there was no wedding, her reaction was more violent than before. She screamed in anguish, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her throat. And when she vanished this time, she left behind a lingering scent of funeral incense, mixed with wedding perfume. I began researching historical records of weddings and crimes in the Kamakura area. What I found explained the supernatural encounters, but made them infinitely more tragic. In 1953, a young woman named Hayashi Akiko had been murdered by her prospective in-laws on what was supposed to be her wedding day. The groom's family had arranged the marriage specifically to obtain the dowry money her family had promised, but they had planned from the beginning to kill her immediately after the ceremony to avoid having to support her or share their family wealth. The crime had been discovered when Akiko's body was found near Hachiman Shrine, still wearing her wedding kimono. The investigation revealed that the groom's family had lured her to Kamakura under the pretense of an evening wedding ceremony, then strangled her and taken the dowry money. Several family members were arrested and executed for the crime, but the scandal had been largely forgotten over the decades. Akiko had died, believing she was making a noble sacrifice for her family's financial security, only to discover in her final moments that she had been betrayed in the most profound way possible. Her spirit was trapped in the journey to a wedding that was never meant to happen, eternally traveling to a ceremony that would end in her death. The encounters continued throughout the autumn and winter, always following the same pattern. Akiko would appear near various shrines throughout Tokyo, dressed in her wedding kimono, asking to be taken to her ceremony in Kamakura. During each ride, she would speak about her family obligations, her hopes for the future, and her willingness to sacrifice personal happiness for duty. But the most disturbing aspect of these encounters was their effect on my other passengers. Anyone who rode in my taxi in the days following Akiko's appearances would be affected by the residual emotional contamination she left behind. The feelings of betrayal and broken trust were so intense that they began to destroy the relationships of people who had nothing to do with the original tragedy. Couples would suddenly begin fighting about faithfulness and honesty. Engaged couples would break up, convinced that their partners were marrying them for financial reasons rather than love. Parents would become suspicious of their children's motives, and children would lose trust in their parents' promises. One young woman, who rode in my taxi 3 days after an encounter with Akiko, broke off her engagement because she became convinced her fiancé was only interested in her family's money. A middle-aged businessman started accusing his wife of infidelity based on nothing more than the overwhelming sense of betrayal he felt during and after his taxi ride. The spiritual contamination was spreading beyond the taxi itself. People who had been affected by Akiko's residual emotions would carry those feelings into their own relationships, creating a chain reaction of suspicion and mistrust that rippled through entire families and social networks. I consulted with a Shinto priest at one of the shrines where Akiko frequently appeared. He explained that some forms of betrayal are so profound they create spiritual pollution that can affect anyone who comes into contact with the victim's energy. This young woman died believing in the sanctity of marriage and family honor, he told me. When that belief was destroyed so violently, it created a spiritual wound that continues to bleed into the world of the living. She carries with her the pain of every betrayed bride, every broken promise, every family that values money more than human life. He performed purification rituals on my taxi and gave me protective amulets to place at the entry points. But these measures could only limit the contamination, not eliminate it entirely. Akiko's betrayal was too fundamental, her innocence too completely destroyed, for traditional remedies to fully counteract. The priest also explained that Akiko's spirit was probably drawn to the temple district because she was still seeking the sacred wedding ceremony she had been promised. Shrines represent the intersection between the human and divine worlds, places where promises are supposed to be kept and sacred bonds are formed. Her spirit couldn't accept that her wedding had been a lie from the beginning. The encounters continue to this day, though I've learned to recognize the signs and minimize the contamination. When I see a bride in white kimono near a shrine in the evening, I know it's Akiko seeking transport to her impossible wedding. I drive her to Kamakura, listen to her speak about duty and sacrifice, witness her devastation when she discovers the truth again, and then spend days purifying my taxi and warning other drivers about the emotional hazard. The psychological impact has been enormous, not just on me, but on the entire community of people who work in the temple district. We've all learned to recognize the symptoms of Akiko's contamination: sudden paranoia about being betrayed by loved ones, compulsive checking of partners' faithfulness, and an overwhelming sense that family relationships are based on financial gain rather than genuine affection. Some taxi drivers have requested transfers to other areas of the city, unable to handle the repeated exposure to such concentrated betrayal and heartbreak. Others have developed their own protective rituals, carrying multiple amulets and performing cleansing ceremonies after every shift. But I continue working in the temple district, partly because I need the income, and partly because I feel someone should witness Akiko's eternal journey to her wedding that will never happen. Her story serves as a warning about what happens when family honor becomes more important than human life, when marriage becomes a financial transaction rather than a sacred bond. Every time I drive her to Kamakura and watch her realize that her wedding is a lie, I'm reminded of the young women throughout history who have been sacrificed for family, financial security, who have trusted in promises that were never meant to be kept. Akiko's white wedding kimono has become a symbol of innocence betrayed, of trust destroyed by greed, of the terrible price that some families are willing to pay for money. Her spirit continues seeking the sacred ceremony she was promised, but finding only the empty shrine grounds where her dreams died along with her body. The contamination she brings affects everyone she encounters, because betrayal of this magnitude touches something universal in human experience. We all fear being deceived by those we trust most. We all worry that our relationships might be based on something other than genuine love, and we all carry the potential for both devastating others and being devastated ourselves. Akiko's eternal wedding journey serves as a reminder that some promises are so sacred they transcend death, and some betrayals are so profound they poison the spiritual atmosphere for generations. Her white kimono continues to gleam in the lamplight near Tokyo's shrines, a beautiful and terrible testament to love destroyed by greed and honor, corrupted by money. The Flooded Taxi Mystery. My name is Watanabe Jun, and I work part-time as a taxi driver in Tokyo while attending graduate school at Waseda University. The flexible schedule allows me to study for my engineering degree during the day and earn money for tuition and living expenses during evening and weekend shifts. I chose taxi driving specifically because I thought it would be straightforward. Work, pick up passengers, drive them to their destinations, collect the fare, repeat. I never expected my car to become a vessel for the dead, carrying victims of one of Tokyo's worst natural disasters on their eternal search for safety that will never come. The flooding incidents began in the autumn of 2024, during what should have been routine evening shifts. At first, I thought there was something wrong with my taxi's air conditioning system, or that I was driving through unusually humid weather. But as these experiences became more frequent and more intense, I realized I was dealing with something far beyond mechanical problems. The first time it happened was on a rainy October night. I had picked up an elderly man near Shibuya Station who wanted to go to the Sumida River area. He was dressed in simple work clothes that looked like they had been soaked and partially dried multiple times. His hair was damp, and his shoes squelched against my car's floor mats as he settled into the back seat. About 10 minutes into the drive, I noticed that my feet were feeling cold and wet inside my shoes. I looked down and was shocked to see that there was about an inch of murky water covering the floor of my taxi. The water appeared to be rising from nowhere. There were no visible leaks, no broken windows, no way for exterior water to be entering the vehicle. "Excuse me," I called back to my passenger. "There seems to be water getting into the car somehow. Are you all right?" He didn't respond. He was staring straight ahead with an expression of intense concentration, as if listening for something I couldn't hear. The water continued to rise, reaching my ankles and beginning to soak into the seat upholstery. I pulled over to investigate the source of the flooding, but when I turned around to ask my passenger to step out while I checked the car, the back seat was empty. He had vanished without any sound of the doors opening or closing. But the water remained, and now I could smell something distinctly unpleasant, the muddy, organic scent of river water, mixed with sewage and decay. It took me over an hour to remove all the water from my taxi, using towels and a small pump I keep for emergencies. The strange thing was that once the water was gone, there was no trace of where it had come from. No damaged seals, no broken components, nothing that could explain how several gallons of murky water had appeared inside my sealed vehicle. I reported the incident to my taxi company as a mechanical problem, but their inspection found nothing wrong with my car. I began to think I had imagined the whole experience until it happened again 3 weeks later. This time, my passenger was a middle-aged woman carrying a small child. They both wore the kind of simple clothing that working-class families might have worn decades earlier, and both were completely soaked as if they had just been pulled from a river. The woman kept looking anxiously out the windows, pointing at tall buildings and elevated highways. "Is the water still rising?" she asked urgently. "We need to get to higher ground. The radio said to evacuate to the hills, but I can't find them." I looked around at the cityscape we were driving through modern Tokyo, with its elevated expressways, multi-story buildings, and sophisticated drainage systems. There was no flood visible anywhere, just normal city streets with the usual light rain. "Ma'am, there's no flooding that I can see," I told her. "Where exactly do you need to go?" She gave me an address that didn't seem to exist anymore, describing landmarks that sounded like they might have been part of Tokyo's geography decades ago. As we drove, the water began rising in my taxi again, this time reaching several inches in depth, and bringing with it debris that looked like it had been swept along by a current, leaves, twigs, pieces of paper, and small objects that might have come from flooded homes. The woman and child sat silently in the rising water, holding each other tightly. They seemed to be waiting for the water to recede, or for someone to rescue them. But their hope was mixed with a growing desperation that filled the car with palpable anxiety. When I stopped to try to help them evacuate the flooded vehicle, they disappeared just as the previous passenger had. But this time, they left behind more than just water and the smell of the river. There were muddy footprints on my seat covers and small toys that looked like they had been waterlogged for years. I began researching Tokyo's history of floods, thinking there might be some connection between my phantom passengers and past disasters. What I discovered explained the supernatural encounters, but made them infinitely more tragic. In September of 1958, Typhoon Ida had struck the Tokyo area with devastating force. The storm brought torrential rains that overwhelmed the city's drainage systems and caused massive flooding throughout the lowland areas. The Sumida River and other waterways had burst their banks, turning entire neighborhoods into temporary lakes. Hundreds of people had died in the flood, many of them swept away while trying to evacuate their homes or reach higher ground. The victims included entire families who had been trapped in their houses as the water rose, elderly people who couldn't escape quickly enough, and children who had been separated from their parents in the chaos. The newspaper archives from that time contained heartbreaking accounts of people who had spent hours or even days waiting on rooftops and upper floors for rescue that came too late. Many had died not from drowning, but from exposure, exhaustion, and despair while waiting for help that never arrived. I realized that my phantom passengers were victims of the 1958 flood, still trying to reach safety more than 60 years after the disaster. They were trapped in their final desperate attempts to escape the rising water, endlessly seeking the higher ground that might have saved them. The flooding incidents in my taxi became more frequent as winter approached. Almost every week, I would pick up passengers who were clearly flood victims, families carrying salvaged belongings, workers trying to get home to check on their families, elderly people who had been caught unprepared by the rapidly rising water. Each encounter followed the same pattern. The passengers would ask to be taken to locations that no longer existed or had been completely rebuilt since the flood. As we drove, my taxi would fill with muddy river water that rose to dangerous levels. The passengers would sit calmly in the flooding vehicle, as if they were accustomed to being surrounded by water, but their expressions showed the strain of prolonged fear and hopelessness. The psychological impact of these encounters was severe. Every time my taxi filled with floodwater, I experienced the terror of drowning and the desperation of being trapped by rising water with no means of escape. These weren't my own memories, but they felt completely real while they were happening. The phantom passengers never spoke directly to me during these rides. They were focused entirely on their own survival, looking for landmarks that had been washed away, trying to navigate to safety through a city that had been completely transformed by urban development since their deaths. The most disturbing encounters involved families with young children. I would watch parents trying to keep their babies above the water level, see children clinging to their mothers as the muddy water rose around them, witness the heartbreaking moment when they realized that rescue wasn't coming. These family groups would leave behind the most evidence of their presence: children's toys, family photographs damaged by water, and personal items that looked like they had been hastily grabbed during an emergency evacuation. I started carrying towels, blankets, and emergency supplies in my taxi, even though I knew they couldn't help my phantom passengers. It was my way of honoring their memory and acknowledging the tragedy they had experienced. The smell of river water became a permanent feature of my taxi's interior. No amount of cleaning or air freshener could eliminate the musty, organic scent that lingered after each flooding incident. Other passengers who rode in my car during normal fares would comment on the unusual smell and ask if there had been water damage. I consulted with a Buddhist monk about how to help the flood victims find peace. He explained that some disasters are so traumatic they create spiritual imprints that can persist for generations. These people died in terror, fighting for their lives against the rising water, he told me. Their spirits are still trying to complete their escape, still searching for the safety they never found. The flood exists for them in an eternal present, and they cannot accept that the danger has passed. He suggested that I was serving as a kind of spiritual ferry, helping the flood victims continue their search for higher ground, even though that search could never succeed. The modern Tokyo they were trying to navigate bore no resemblance to the city that had existed during the flood, but their spirits couldn't adjust to the changes. The monk performed blessing ceremonies for my taxi and gave me protective amulets to place at the spiritual entry points. But he warned that the flood victims were probably too focused on survival to be aware of spiritual intervention. They are not haunting your taxi with malicious intent, he explained. They are simply trying to save their lives over and over again. Your vehicle has somehow become part of their escape route, even though it cannot take them to the safety they seek. The flooding continues to this day. Several times each month, victims of the 1958 typhoon get into my taxi, bringing with them the rising water that killed them and the desperate hope that they can still reach safety if they just keep moving toward higher ground. I've learned to recognize the signs. Passengers in period clothing who are completely soaked, requests for addresses in areas that were rebuilt decades ago, and the first trickle of muddy water appearing on my floor mats. When these encounters begin, I focus on driving safely while water rises around my ankles, listening to my passengers' urgent discussions about evacuation routes and rescue plans. The engineering knowledge I'm gaining in graduate school has given me a deeper understanding of how the 1958 flood happened. Tokyo's rapid post-war development had created drainage problems that the city's infrastructure couldn't handle during extreme weather events. The victims in my taxi died partly because of urban planning failures and insufficient disaster preparation. This technical understanding makes the supernatural encounters even more tragic. These people died not just because of a natural disaster, but because of human failures to protect vulnerable populations. Their spirits continue seeking safety that should have been provided by better infrastructure and emergency planning. I've considered changing jobs to escape the psychological burden of these encounters, but I've come to understand that I'm providing an important service. Even though I can't actually save the flood victims, I'm helping them continue their eternal search for survival. In some way, my taxi has become their escape route, allowing them to keep trying to outrun the water that killed them. The muddy footprints and river smell have become familiar features of my work life. I carry extra cleaning supplies and have learned to explain the unusual odors to normal passengers without mentioning the supernatural aspects. Most people accept that taxi work involves occasionally transporting people who have been caught in the rain. Sometimes I imagine what it would be like if the flood victims could finally reach the higher ground they're seeking, if they could find the safety that eluded them in life. But modern Tokyo's elevated highways and tall buildings exist in a different reality than the one they're navigating. They're searching for hills and high ground in a city that has been completely transformed by urban development. The 1958 flood victims continue their eternal evacuation through my taxi, carrying with them the rising water that claimed their lives and the hope that somewhere ahead lies the safety they never found. And I continue to serve as their driver, helping them search for higher ground that exists only in memory and hope. The delivery that never arrives. My name is Kobayashi Satoru, and I've been driving taxi in Tokyo's residential districts for 19 years. Unlike drivers who work the business areas or entertainment districts, I spend most of my time in quiet neighborhoods, taking families to schools and hospitals, helping elderly residents with their shopping trips, and occasionally rushing expectant mothers to maternity wards. It's peaceful work that fits well with my temperament, and I take pride in being part of the community rather than just another anonymous service provider. What I'm about to tell you began in the winter of 2024 and has continued with heartbreaking regularity since then. It involves a passenger who represents every parent's worst nightmare, a journey that can never reach its destination, and the kind of grief that transforms the very air around it into something almost too heavy to breathe. The first call came on a snowy February morning around 4 a.m. The dispatcher's voice was urgent as she gave me the pickup address and destination. Emergency transport needed at the Yamada residence in Setagaya. Mother with newborn twins needs immediate transport to Tokyo Metropolitan Hospital. Medical emergency. I drove quickly through the quiet residential streets, my taxi's heater working hard against the winter cold. Emergency calls involving newborns always made me nervous, but they were part of the job. I had transported dozens of families during medical crises over the years, and I knew how important it was to get patients to the hospital as quickly and safely as possible. When I arrived at the address, I expected to see a typical residential emergency. Worried family members, medical supplies, maybe a midwife or paramedic providing initial care. Instead, I found a young woman in a blood-stained nightgown standing alone on the sidewalk, clutching two small bundles wrapped in blankets. She was in her early 20s, with long black hair that looked like it hadn't been combed in days, and the pale, exhausted appearance of someone who had just given birth. But what struck me most was the expression on her face, a mixture of desperate hope and growing panic that I had never seen before. "Please," she said as she approached my taxi, "my babies need to get to the hospital immediately. They're not breathing properly," the midwife said. She said there might be complications. I helped her into the back seat, being careful not to disturb the bundle she was holding. As soon as she settled in, I noticed something unusual about the atmosphere in my taxi. The air seemed to grow thicker and more oppressive, filled with an emotional weight that made it difficult to breathe normally. During the drive to the hospital, she spoke constantly to the babies, alternating between soothing words and increasingly frantic pleas. "It's going to be okay, little ones. Mama's taking you to the doctors. They'll know what to do. Just hold on a little longer." But as we drove, her voice became more desperate. "Why aren't you crying? Babies are supposed to cry. Please make some noise so Mama knows you're all right." I glanced in the rearview mirror and noticed that the bundles she was holding were completely still and silent. Most newborns would be fussing or at least making small movements, but these babies made no sound at all. The emotional atmosphere in the taxi was becoming overwhelming. I found myself experiencing a crushing sense of maternal anxiety and grief that wasn't my own, as if her desperation was somehow contaminating the physical space around us. My hands began shaking on the steering wheel, and I had to fight back tears that had no source in my own life. When we arrived at the hospital's emergency entrance, I expected her to rush inside with the babies. Instead, she sat in the back seat for a moment, looking confused and lost. "This is the hospital," I told her gently. "The doctors are waiting inside." She looked at the brightly lit emergency room entrance, then down at the bundles in her arms. Slowly, her expression changed from hope to devastation as some terrible realization dawned on her. "They're already gone, aren't they?" she whispered. "My babies are already gone." Before I could respond, she and the bundles she was carrying faded away like mist, leaving behind only the overwhelming scent of blood and the lingering echo of her anguished voice calling for medical help that would never come. I sat in my empty taxi outside the hospital for over an hour, unable to shake the profound grief that had filled my vehicle. The emotional contamination was so intense that I couldn't bring myself to take another fare that day. Every time I tried to start the engine, I was overwhelmed by the memory of her desperate pleas and the terrible silence of the babies she had been trying to save. The second encounter happened 2 weeks later, following exactly the same pattern. The same emergency call, the same young mother with the same 2 bundles, the same desperate journey to a hospital that couldn't help them because they had already died. This time, during the ride, she told me more about what had happened. She had chosen to have a home birth to save money, hiring a midwife who claimed to be qualified but lacked proper medical training and equipment. When complications arose during the delivery of the twins, the midwife had been unable to provide adequate care. She said everything was normal, the mother explained, her voice breaking. She said home births were safer than hospitals, more natural. But when the babies came, they weren't breathing right, and she didn't know what to do. She kept saying they would be fine, that we just needed to wait a little longer. By the time the midwife admitted that she couldn't handle the situation and called for emergency transport, it was too late. The babies had died from complications that could have been easily treated in a proper medical facility. I began researching cases of maternal and infant mortality related to home births with unqualified practitioners. What I found was a disturbing pattern of families choosing dangerous alternatives to hospital births because of economic pressures, cultural preferences, or distrust of medical institutions. The young mother I kept transporting, whose name I learned from news reports, was Tanaka Yuki, had died 3 days after her babies, succumbing to complications from childbirth that the incompetent midwife had failed to address. The entire family had been destroyed by a single bad decision made under financial pressure. The encounters continued throughout the spring and summer, always following the same heartbreaking pattern. Yuki would call for emergency transport to the hospital, climb into my taxi with her dead babies, spend the journey desperately trying to convince herself they could still be saved, and then fade away when confronted with the reality that they were already beyond help. But the most disturbing aspect of these supernatural rides was their effect on other passengers. Anyone who rode in my taxi in the days following an encounter with Yuki would be affected by the residual maternal grief and medical anxiety she left behind. Pregnant women would suddenly become paranoid about their prenatal care, demanding additional medical tests and second opinions from different doctors. New mothers would become obsessed with their babies' breathing patterns, checking on them constantly throughout the night. Even passengers who had no children would experience overwhelming anxiety about medical emergencies and the adequacy of healthcare systems. The contamination was so severe that several passengers complained of feeling physically ill during their rides, describing sensations of suffocation, chest pain, and panic attacks that seemed to come from nowhere. One pregnant woman had to be taken to the emergency room after experiencing what appeared to be premature labor contractions triggered by the residual stress in my taxi. I consulted with a Buddhist monk about how to cleanse my vehicle of the maternal grief that was affecting innocent passengers. He performed several purification ceremonies and provided protective amulets, but he warned me that some forms of loss are too profound to be completely eliminated by spiritual intervention. This young mother died believing she could still save her children, he explained. Her spirit is trapped in that final desperate hope, the belief that if she can just reach the hospital in time, the doctors will be able to reverse what has already happened. She cannot accept that her choices led to their deaths. He suggested that Yuki's spirit was bound, not just by her own guilt and grief, but by the broader failure of society to provide adequate health care and education to vulnerable families. Her tragedy represented thousands of similar cases where economic pressure and inadequate medical access had led to preventable deaths. The rides continue to this day. Every few weeks, I receive an emergency call to transport Yuki and her babies to the hospital for treatment that can never save them. Each journey is a reenactment of her final, desperate attempt to undo the consequences of decisions made under impossible circumstances. The psychological impact on me has been enormous. I now carry emergency medical supplies in my taxi, even though I know they cannot help my phantom passenger. I've taken first aid courses and learned to recognize signs of medical distress, hoping to be better prepared for real emergencies involving living patients. But nothing can prepare me for the emotional weight of witnessing Yuki's eternal journey from hope to despair. Every time she climbs into my taxi with her silent babies, I experience the full force of her maternal love and the crushing realization that love alone cannot save the children she failed to protect. The contamination has made me hypersensitive to the vulnerabilities of the families I serve in my daily work. When I transport pregnant women to medical appointments, I find myself asking detailed questions about their healthcare plans and the qualifications of their medical providers. When I see families struggling with medical bills, I think about how economic pressure can lead to tragic decisions. Other drivers who work residential routes have begun reporting similar encounters. Always the same young mother, always the same emergency call, always the same heartbreaking realization that the help she seeks came too late. The phenomenon has spread beyond my individual taxi to affect the entire network of drivers who serve families in crisis. The most haunting aspect of these encounters is understanding that Yuki represents countless mothers who have lost children due to inadequate medical care, economic pressure, or simple bad luck. Her spirit carries not just her own grief, but the collective anguish of every parent who has outlived their child. Sometimes I wonder if she will ever find peace, or if she is destined to repeat this impossible journey forever. The hospital she seeks can never admit her babies because they died before reaching medical care. The emergency she calls about has already become a tragedy that no amount of rushing can prevent. But I continue to answer her calls, driving her through the quiet residential streets toward a destination that exists only in her desperate hope. In some way, my taxi has become her eternal ambulance, carrying her babies on their final journey toward help that will always be just out of reach. The bundles she holds have never made a sound during our rides, but their silence speaks louder than any cry could. They represent not just two infants who died too young, but the failure of systems that should protect the most vulnerable members of society. Yuki's anguished voice continues to echo in my taxi long after each encounter ends, a reminder that some losses are so profound they contaminate the very air around them, affecting everyone who comes into contact with their lingering pain. The construction worker's last day. My name is Suzuki Takeshi, and I have been driving taxi in Tokyo's industrial districts for 16 years. My route covers the areas around major construction sites, manufacturing plants, and the kind of heavy industry that keeps the city running but remains largely invisible to most residents. I start work at 4 a.m. to catch the early shift workers, the men and women who build Tokyo's infrastructure while the rest of the city sleeps. The industrial districts have their own culture, different from the office buildings and shopping centers. Workers here understand physical danger in ways that salarymen never will. They know that a moment of carelessness, a missing safety check, or a company's cost-cutting measures can mean the difference between going home to their families and never coming home at all. What I'm about to tell you began in the spring of 2024 and has continued with disturbing consistency since then. It involves a passenger who embodies every worker's fear of workplace accidents, a man whose presence fills my taxi with an atmosphere of industrial danger so intense that it affects other passengers for weeks afterward. The first time I saw him was on a chilly May morning, just after 5 a.m. I was parked near a construction site in Shibuya, waiting for workers to finish their shift changes, when a man approached my taxi. He was wearing the standard uniform of a construction worker: hard hat, high visibility vest, steel-toed boots, and work clothes that were covered in dried mud and concrete dust. What struck me immediately was how methodically he moved. Before getting into my taxi, he spent several minutes checking his safety equipment, patting down his vest for tools and safety devices, adjusting his hard hat, and inspecting his boots. This kind of safety consciousness wasn't unusual among construction workers, but there was something almost obsessive about his routine. "Good morning," he said, as he climbed into the back seat. "I need to get to the Takanawa construction site. There's been an accident, and they need me there immediately." His voice carried the kind of urgency that comes with workplace emergencies. I had transported workers to accident sites before, usually supervisors or safety inspectors, called in to assess damage or coordinate rescue efforts. During the drive, he continued his safety checks. He would feel around his vest for equipment, check his pockets for tools, and occasionally tap his hard hat as if ensuring it was properly secured. But each time he searched for something, he would come up empty-handed and look confused. "Where's my safety harness?" he muttered. "I can't work at height without my harness. Company policy requires full safety equipment for all elevated work." I glanced in the rearview mirror and noticed that despite his obsessive checking, he didn't seem to be carrying any of the safety equipment he was looking for. No harness, no safety clips, no fall protection devices that would be standard for construction work. As we drove through the industrial area, the atmosphere in my taxi began to feel oppressive and dangerous. I found myself becoming hyper-aware of potential hazards, other vehicles that might hit us, construction equipment that could malfunction, elevated structures that might collapse. These weren't my usual thoughts while driving, but they felt overwhelming and inescapable while this passenger was in my car. "The company has been cutting corners on safety," he said, his voice filled with growing anxiety. "They're pushing us to work faster, finish projects ahead of schedule. Management says the safety equipment slows us down, costs too much money, but without proper protection." His voice trailed off, and he returned to checking his empty pockets and patting down his vest for equipment that wasn't there. When we arrived at the Takanawa construction site, I expected to see signs of an active emergency: ambulances, fire trucks, safety officials coordinating a response. Instead, the site was empty except for a few pieces of abandoned construction equipment surrounded by safety barriers. "This doesn't look like there's an emergency happening," I observed. My passenger looked out at the empty construction site with growing confusion and distress. "But they called me. There was an accident. Workers were hurt. They need me to assess the safety violations, to make sure something like this doesn't happen again." Before I could respond, he faded away from the back seat, leaving behind only the lingering smell of concrete dust and an overwhelming sense of workplace dread that took hours to shake off. I drove home that morning feeling deeply unsettled, not just by the supernatural disappearance, but by the intense anxiety about workplace safety that had filled my taxi. For days afterward, I found myself obsessively checking my own vehicle for mechanical problems, worried about tire blowouts, brake failures, or accidents that had never concerned me before. The second encounter happened a week later, following the same pattern: the same construction worker, the same obsessive safety checks, the same urgent trip to an empty construction site. This time, during our journey, he told me more about the working conditions that had led to his situation. "They removed half the safety inspectors to save on labor costs," he explained. "Told us we could police ourselves, that experienced workers don't need constant supervision. But when you're working 12-hour shifts, when you're exhausted and trying to meet impossible deadlines, mistakes happen." He described how his construction company had gradually eliminated safety protocols in the name of efficiency and profit margins. Required safety equipment had been declared optional for experienced workers. Mandatory safety breaks had been shortened or eliminated entirely. Accident reporting procedures had been streamlined to discourage workers from filing incident reports that might slow down projects. "I kept telling the supervisors that someone was going to get killed," he said, continuing his futile search for safety equipment. "But they said workers who complained too much about safety were showing a lack of commitment to the company." Over the following months, I encountered him regularly, always at 5 a.m., always traveling to different construction sites throughout Tokyo, always checking for safety equipment that he didn't have, always arriving at empty lots where construction projects had been abandoned or completed years earlier. I began researching industrial accidents in the Tokyo area, trying to understand the connection between my phantom passenger and the sites he directed me to. What I found was a disturbing pattern of workplace deaths caused by corporate negligence and safety violations. The construction worker I was transporting was named Hayashi Kenji. He had been a safety inspector for a mid-sized construction company until his death in a workplace accident 3 years earlier. According to news reports, he had been killed along with 2 other workers when scaffolding collapsed at a high-rise construction site. The investigation revealed that the scaffolding had been improperly installed to save time and money. Required safety equipment had not been provided to workers. The company had been cited for numerous safety violations in the months leading up to the accident, but had continued operating because the fines were cheaper than implementing proper safety measures. Hayashi-san had died trying to inspect the very safety violations that killed him. His final report, found in his pocket after the accident, documented dozens of hazardous conditions that the company had ignored. He had been scheduled to present his findings to management the day after he died. The sites my phantom passenger directed me to were all locations where similar accidents had occurred. Construction sites where workers had died due to inadequate safety measures, corporate cost-cutting, or management's deliberate disregard for worker protection. But the most disturbing aspect of these encounters was their effect on my other passengers. Anyone who rode in my taxi in the days following Hayashi-san's visits would be contaminated by his obsessive safety, anxiety, and workplace paranoia. Office workers would suddenly become convinced that their buildings were structurally unsound. Factory employees would refuse to operate machinery they had used safely for years. Construction workers would quit their jobs after experiencing panic attacks about workplace accidents that hadn't happened. The contamination spread beyond immediate safety concerns. Passengers would become paranoid about their job security, convinced that their employers were planning to eliminate their positions to save money. They would obsess over workplace policies, looking for signs that their companies valued profit over worker welfare. One businessman who rode in my taxi the day after an encounter with Hayashi-san became so convinced that his office building was going to collapse that he refused to return to work for weeks. A factory worker quit his job and moved to a different city after becoming obsessed with the idea that his employer was going to cause a fatal accident through negligence. I consulted with a Buddhist monk about how to cleanse my taxi of the workplace anxiety that was affecting innocent passengers. He performed purification ceremonies and provided protective amulets, but he explained that Hayashi-san's spiritual contamination was particularly difficult to eliminate. This man died trying to prevent exactly the kind of accidents that killed him, the monk told me. His spirit is trapped in an eternal cycle of trying to complete safety inspections that can never prevent the tragedies that have already occurred. He carries with him the accumulated fear of every worker who has died due to corporate negligence. The encounters continue to this day. Every week or two, Hayashi-san appears at my taxi in the early morning hours, obsessively checking for safety equipment that doesn't exist, traveling to construction sites where accidents have already happened, trying to complete inspections that can never prevent the deaths that have already occurred. I've learned to recognize the signs and take precautions to minimize the contamination. I carry purifying amulets and perform cleansing rituals after each encounter. I warn other drivers about the psychological hazards of transporting passengers who carry such concentrated workplace anxiety. But I continue working in the industrial districts, partly because I need the income, and partly because I feel that Hayashi-san's story needs to be witnessed. His death wasn't just a personal tragedy, but a symptom of systemic problems in how Japanese companies balance profit margins against worker safety. The safety equipment he searches for represents more than just harnesses and hard hats. It symbolizes the corporate responsibility for worker welfare that was sacrificed to increase profits and meet impossible deadlines. His eternal safety inspections serve as a reminder of what happens when companies treat workers as expendable resources rather than human beings with families who depend on them coming home safely. Sometimes I wonder if Hayashi-san will ever find the safety equipment he's looking for, or if he's destined to repeat his unsuccessful safety checks forever. The construction sites he visits have all been completed or abandoned, but the same negligent practices that killed him continue at new projects throughout the city. His presence in my taxi serves as a warning about the hidden costs of corporate cost-cutting, the human price of treating safety regulations as optional guidelines rather than essential protections. Every time he checks his empty pockets for equipment that should have been provided by his employer, he reminds me that worker safety isn't just a regulatory requirement, it's a matter of life and death. The construction worker's last day never ends because the conditions that killed him persist throughout the industry. His phantom inspections continue because the real inspections that might have saved him were eliminated to improve company profit margins. And drivers like me continue to witness his eternal search for safety equipment that represents the protection every worker deserves, but too few receive. The Phantom Train Connection. My name is Nakamura Hiroshi, and I have been driving taxi at Tokyo's major train stations for 24 years. Stations are the heartbeat of Tokyo, millions of people flowing through them every day, connecting to destinations across the metropolitan area and beyond. My specialty is serving passengers who have missed their last trains or need transport to stations on discontinued routes. It's steady work that requires knowledge of Tokyo's complex rail network and the patience to deal with tired, frustrated travelers trying to get home. What I'm about to tell you began in the summer of 2024 and has continued with increasing frequency since then. It involves passengers who represent one of Tokyo's darkest chapters in public transportation safety, people whose desperate need to catch their trains has transcended death itself. The first encounter happened on a humid July night, just after midnight. I was parked outside Ikebukuro Station when 3 passengers approached my taxi together. A middle-aged salaryman, a young woman in office attire, and an elderly man carrying a briefcase. They moved with the urgent, slightly frantic energy of people who had just missed their last train connections home. "Excuse me," the salaryman said as they climbed into my taxi. "We need to get to Takadanobaba Station as quickly as possible. The last Yamanote Line train leaves in 15 minutes." I checked my watch. It was already past 12:30 a.m., well after the last trains had stopped running. But passengers often lost track of time or confused the schedule, especially after long work days or evening entertainment. "I'm sorry, but the last trains finished running about 30 minutes ago," I explained gently. "But I can take you wherever you need to go directly." The 3 passengers looked at each other with growing panic. The young woman pulled out her phone and began frantically checking what appeared to be a train schedule app. "No, that can't be right," she said. "The app shows the last Yamanote Line train departing Takadanobaba at 12:47 a.m. We still have time if we hurry." I had been working the station routes for over 2 decades, and I knew the train schedules by heart. The last Yamanote Line trains had stopped running before midnight, as they had for years. But the passengers seemed so convinced and desperate that I decided to drive them to Takadanobaba Station to show them that the station would be closed. During the 15-minute drive, all 3 passengers remained glued to their phones, checking train times and transfer information with increasing anxiety. The atmosphere in my taxi felt charged with desperate energy, as if their need to catch the train was so intense it was affecting the physical space around us. "My wife is expecting me home," the elderly man explained. "She worries when I'm late. I promised I would be on the last train." "I have to catch the connection to Chiba," the young woman added. "My apartment is near the end of the line. If I miss this train, there's no other way to get home tonight." "The company party ran too long," the salaryman said, checking his phone obsessively. "My manager kept buying rounds of drinks. I couldn't leave before the boss, but now I'm going to miss my connection." When we arrived at Takadanobaba Station, I expected to find the familiar sight of a closed station with security gates locked and platform lights dimmed. Instead, my passengers pointed excitedly at what they claimed to see. Platform displays showing arrival times, crowds of late-night travelers, and the sound of approaching trains. "There, the platform is still open," the salaryman said. "We can still make it." But when I looked at the station, I saw only the standard closed facility with no signs of activity. The discrepancy between what they were seeing and what I could observe was deeply disturbing. My taxi radio suddenly crackled to life with what sounded like station announcements. "The last Yamanote Line train, bound for Shimbashi, will be departing from Platform 2 in 3 minutes. Please stand behind the safety line." I grabbed my radio handset, thinking the dispatcher was trying to contact me, but when I responded, there was only static. The announcement seemed to be coming from somewhere else entirely. The 3 passengers quickly paid their fare and rushed toward the station entrance. But as they approached the closed security gates, they simply faded away like morning mist. The station remained empty and dark, but my radio continued picking up phantom train announcements for several more minutes. The second encounter happened 2 weeks later, with a different group of passengers but following the same disturbing pattern. This time, it was a family of 4 parents with 2 teenage children, all desperate to catch a train on the Keihin-Tohoku line that they claimed was still running. They directed me to a station that I knew had been closed for renovations for over a year, but they insisted it was operational and that their connecting train was waiting. During the ride, my radio picked up announcements for train lines that had been discontinued decades earlier, routes that no longer appeared on any current Tokyo rail map. I began researching historical train accidents in Tokyo, particularly incidents involving missed connections or platform safety. What I discovered explained my supernatural encounters, but made them infinitely more tragic. 7 years earlier, in July of 2017, there had been a catastrophic platform accident at Ikebukuro Station during the evening rush hour. A delay in the Yamanote line had caused massive overcrowding, as thousands of passengers waited for trains that were running behind schedule. When a train finally arrived, the crush of people trying to board had been so intense that several passengers were pushed onto the tracks. The accident had killed 5 people and injured dozens more. Among the victims were the same 3 passengers I had first encountered: the salaryman, the young woman, and the elderly man with his briefcase. The victims had all been trying to catch connecting trains that would take them home to their families. They had died not from the train impact itself, but from being crushed by the desperate crowd of people who, like them, just wanted to get home after a long day of work. The family I had encountered in my second supernatural ride had also died in a platform accident, though at a different station and several years earlier. They had been traveling together to visit relatives when a similar crowd crush during a service disruption had pushed them into the path of an oncoming train. I realized that my phantom passengers were victims of Tokyo's rush hour transportation pressures, people who had died while trying to navigate the city's overcrowded rail system. Their spirits were trapped in their final desperate attempt to catch the trains that would take them home, eternally seeking connections that no longer existed. The encounters continued throughout the autumn and winter, always following the same heartbreaking pattern. Groups of passengers would approach my taxi near major stations, desperately needing to catch last trains or make connections on discontinued routes. My radio would pick up phantom announcements for services that had been eliminated years or decades earlier, and my meter would run to stations that had been closed, relocated, or demolished. Each group of passengers represented a different transportation tragedy: platform accidents, train derailments, fires in subway tunnels, or simply people who had died from stress-related health problems while commuting. They were all bound together by their final shared experience of trying to get home through Tokyo's complex and sometimes dangerous public transportation network. The psychological impact of these encounters was profound. Every time I picked up phantom passengers desperate to catch non-existent trains, I experienced their crushing anxiety about being stranded, about disappointing families who were waiting for them, about the social and economic consequences of missing important connections. The contamination affected my other passengers as well. People who rode in my taxi after these supernatural encounters would become obsessed with train schedules, arriving at stations hours early to ensure they didn't miss their connections. They would download multiple train apps and constantly check for service disruptions, delays, or schedule changes. Some passengers developed such severe anxiety about public transportation that they stopped using trains altogether, preferring to spend enormous amounts on taxi fares rather than risk being caught in crowds or missing connections. Others became convinced that the train system was fundamentally unsafe and would only travel during off-peak hours. I consulted with a Shinto priest about how to help the phantom passengers find peace. He explained that transportation accidents create particularly strong spiritual attachments because they involve people who were actively trying to complete journeys when they died. These passengers died while traveling, he told me. Their spirits are still trying to complete trips that were interrupted by tragedy. They cannot accept that their journeys have ended, so they continue seeking the trains that will take them home. He performed purification ceremonies for my taxi and the stations where I regularly encountered phantom passengers, but he warned that transportation spirits are among the most difficult to help because their attachment to movement and destination is so strong. The priest also explained that Tokyo's rail network itself had become spiritually contaminated by decades of transportation tragedies. Every major station, he said, carries the residual energy of people who died while trying to catch trains, miss connections, or simply get home safely. The encounters continue to this day. Several times each month, groups of phantom passengers approach my taxi near major stations, desperately seeking transport to make train connections that no longer exist. My radio picks up announcements for discontinued routes, my meter runs to demolish stations, and my passengers fade away when they realize that the trains they're trying to catch stopped running years ago. I've learned to carry rail maps from different historical periods, trying to understand the routes my phantom passengers are attempting to complete. Many of them died trying to catch trains on lines that were eliminated during station renovations, route consolidations, or service cuts implemented to improve efficiency. The most heartbreaking encounters involve families traveling together, parents trying to get children home safely, or elderly passengers who died simply because they couldn't navigate Tokyo's constantly changing transportation system quickly enough to avoid being caught in dangerous crowds. Sometimes I wonder if any of my phantom passengers will ever complete their journeys, or if they're destined to eternally seek trains that have been discontinued, stations that have been demolished, and connections that exist only in the memories of a transportation network that no longer serves the routes they need to travel. The phantom train announcements that come through my radio have become a nightly soundtrack to my work, reminders of the human cost of Tokyo's transportation pressures. Each announcement represents not just a missed connection, but a life that ended while trying to navigate the complex systems that millions of people depend on to get home safely each day. My taxi has become a kind of phantom transportation service, carrying the spirits of accident victims on impossible journeys to stations that no longer exist, helping them search for trains that will never arrive, serving passengers who will never complete the trips that killed them while they were still alive. The Department Store Shopper. My name is Kimura Daisuke, and I have been driving taxi in Tokyo's shopping districts for 14 years. My routes cover the major department stores and retail areas, places like Shibuya, Harajuku, and Ginza, where people come to buy everything from daily necessities to special gifts for important occasions. The shopping districts have their own seasonal rhythms, with different holidays and celebrations bringing their own particular kinds of customers and their own emotional atmospheres. December and January are always the busiest times, when families prepare for New Year's celebrations and the complex gift-giving traditions that mark Japan's most important holiday. I transport many elderly customers during this season, Grandparents carefully selecting presents for children and grandchildren, parents shopping for elaborate New Year's foods, and families coordinating their complicated celebration plans. What I'm about to tell you began in the winter of 2023 and has continued every year since then, always during the weeks leading up to New Year's Day. It involves a passenger who represents one of modern Japan's most heartbreaking social problems: elderly people who die alone. Forgotten by families, too busy or too distant to maintain the relationships that once defined Japanese society. The first time I encountered her was on a cold December evening, just as the department stores were closing for the night. I was parked outside Mitsukoshi in Ginza when an elderly woman approached my taxi, walking slowly and carefully, as many older people do when navigating Tokyo's busy sidewalks. She was probably in her 70s, neatly dressed in the formal but understated style that women of her generation prefer. Her gray hair was perfectly arranged, and she wore the kind of quality wool coat that suggested she had once been comfortably middle class. But what struck me most was the number of shopping bags she was carrying, at least 6 or 7 bags from different department stores, all filled with what appeared to be carefully selected gifts. "Good evening," she said politely as I helped her load the bags into my taxi. "I need to go to my son's house in Setagaya. The family is gathering for New Year's preparations, and I have presents for everyone." Her voice carried the kind of excited anticipation that grandparents often display when discussing visits with their families. As she settled into the back seat, surrounded by her shopping bags, she began describing the gifts she had purchased. "I found the most beautiful doll for my granddaughter. She's 8 years old now. Can you imagine? And for my grandson, I bought one of those electronic games that all the children seem to love. I also got something special for my daughter-in-law, a silk scarf from that nice store on the 4th floor." During the 30-minute drive to Setagaya, she continued talking about her family with obvious love and pride. She described her son's successful career, her daughter-in-law's kindness, and her grandchildren's achievements in school. But there was something in her voice that made me feel uneasy, a quality of forced cheerfulness that seemed to be covering some deeper sadness. As we drove, the atmosphere in my taxi began to feel heavy with an emotion I couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't fear or anger, but something more subtle and more painful, a crushing sense of loneliness that seemed to emanate from my passenger and fill the enclosed space around us. When we arrived at the address she had given me, I expected to see a house with lights on, maybe family members waiting to greet her, or at least signs of New Year's preparation activities. Instead, we pulled up to a small apartment building that looked completely dark and empty. "This doesn't look like there's anyone home," I observed. She stared at the dark building for a long moment, and I watched her cheerful expression slowly change to confusion and then to devastation. "But they said they promised they would be here for New Year's. We always celebrate together as a family. They know how important this is to me." Before I could respond, she and all her shopping bags faded away from the back seat, leaving behind only the overwhelming scent of department store perfume and a crushing sense of abandonment that took hours to shake off. I drove home that night feeling profoundly depressed, affected not just by the supernatural disappearance, but by the intensity of loneliness that had filled my taxi. For days afterward, I found myself calling my own elderly parents more frequently, driven by an irrational fear that they might be sitting alone in their apartment, waiting for family visits that would never come. The second encounter happened 2 weeks later, following exactly the same pattern. The same elderly woman with the same shopping bags, the same excited descriptions of family gifts, the same crushing realization when we arrived at an empty apartment building. This time, during our drive, she told me more about her situation. "My son lives so far away now," she explained. "His job keeps him very busy, and the grandchildren have so many activities: school, cram classes, sports clubs. It's difficult for modern families to find time for traditional celebrations. She described how family gatherings had become smaller and less frequent over the years. First, her husband had died, leaving her alone in their apartment. Then her son had moved to a different city for his career, visiting only occasionally. The grandchildren, who had once spent summers with her, had grown older and developed their own social lives. But they always come for New Year's, she insisted. That's our special time together. I spend weeks preparing, buying the perfect gifts, planning the traditional foods. Family is the most important thing. I began researching cases of elderly people who had died alone in Tokyo, a phenomenon that had become tragically common in modern Japan. What I discovered explained my supernatural encounters, but made them infinitely more heartbreaking. The elderly woman I was transporting, whose name I learned from news reports was Tanaka Sachiko, had died alone in her apartment 2 years earlier, just 3 days before New Year's Day. She had been found surrounded by carefully wrapped gifts that she had purchased for a family gathering that never happened. According to the news reports, her son had been planning to visit for New Year's, but had canceled at the last minute due to work obligations. Her daughter-in-law had sent apologetic messages about how busy the children were with their winter activities. The grandchildren had made plans with their friends instead of visiting their grandmother. Tanaka-san had died of what the medical examiner called natural causes, but the investigating officers noted signs that suggested she had been suffering from severe depression and social isolation. Her apartment contained evidence of extensive New Year's preparations, traditional foods that had gone uneaten, a carefully cleaned house ready for guests who never arrived, and shopping bags full of gifts that would never be opened. The most tragic detail was that her family had not discovered her death for over a week. When they finally came to check on her, concerned by her lack of response to phone calls, they found her surrounded by the New Year's gifts she had purchased for them. I realized that Tanaka-san's spirit was trapped in her final desperate preparations for a family celebration that would never happen. Every year, during the weeks leading up to New Year's, she would repeat her shopping trips and her hopeful journey to the family gathering that had been canceled after her death. The encounters continued every December and January, always following the same heartbreaking pattern. Tanaka-san would appear with her shopping bags full of carefully selected gifts, talk excitedly about seeing her family, and then fade away when confronted with the reality that no one was waiting for her. But the most disturbing aspect of these encounters was their effect on my other passengers. Anyone who rode in my taxi in the days following Tanaka-san's visits would be contaminated by her profound loneliness and family abandonment. Adult children would suddenly become overwhelmed with guilt about not visiting their elderly parents frequently enough. They would cancel social plans to make unexpected visits to aging relatives, driven by an irrational fear that their parents might die alone while waiting for family contact. Some passengers would become obsessed with maintaining family relationships, calling elderly relatives multiple times per day, and insisting on elaborate family gatherings that exhausted everyone involved. Others would become convinced that their own families were planning to abandon them, leading to paranoid accusations and damaged relationships. One middle-aged businessman, who rode in my taxi the day after an encounter with Tanaka-san, quit his job and moved back to his hometown to care for his aging mother, convinced that career success was meaningless if it meant neglecting family obligations. A young mother became so anxious about family isolation that she moved her entire household in with her elderly in-laws, creating tensions that ultimately led to divorce. I consulted with a Buddhist monk about how to help Tanaka-san find peace and cleanse my taxi of the contamination she left behind. He performed several purification ceremonies and explained that elderly spirits who die from loneliness create some of the most powerful forms of spiritual pollution. This woman died believing that family relationships were the foundation of human happiness, he told me. When those relationships failed her in her final moments, it created a spiritual wound that continues to affect anyone who comes into contact with her energy. She carries with her the accumulated loneliness of every elderly person who has been forgotten by their families. The monk suggested that Tanaka-san's spirit represented a broader crisis in Japanese society, where traditional family structures had been weakened by economic pressures, urbanization, and changing social values. Her eternal shopping trips were a manifestation of the collective guilt felt by families who had allowed career demands and modern lifestyles to erode the elder care traditions that had once defined Japanese culture. The encounters continue every winter, following the seasonal rhythm of New Year's preparations. Each December, Tanaka-san appears with her department store bags, filled with hope about family celebrations that will never happen. Each January, she disappears when confronted with the empty apartment where no family gathering awaits her. I've learned to carry purifying amulets during the winter holiday season, and to warn other drivers about the emotional hazards of picking up elderly shoppers who seem to be carrying too many gifts for families who might not appreciate to their efforts. But I continue working the shopping districts during New Year's season, partly because the income is good during the busy holiday period, and partly because I feel that Tanaka-san's story needs to be witnessed. Her eternal shopping trips serve as a reminder of what happens when families become too busy to maintain the relationships that give elderly people meaning and purpose. The gifts she carries represent more than just material objects. They symbolize the love and connection that elderly people desperately want to share with younger generations who have moved on to lives that don't include space for traditional family obligations. Sometimes I wonder if Tanaka-san will ever find the family gathering she's seeking, or if she's destined to repeat her hopeful shopping trips forever. The department stores she visits sell the same kinds of gifts year after year, but the families she's trying to reach exist only in her memories of happier times when generations still celebrated together. Her shopping bags continue to be filled with presents for grandchildren who never visit, gifts for a daughter-in-law who sent apologetic text messages instead of coming for dinner, and tokens of love for a son who chose career obligations over his mother's final New Year's celebration. The department store shopper continues her eternal preparations for a family gathering that exists only in her loving imagination. And taxi drivers like me continue to transport her toward reunions that can never happen, carrying her hope through shopping districts that are filled with everything money can buy, except the family connections that money cannot restore. The exam student's pressure. My name is Hayashi Kenji, and I have been driving taxi in Tokyo's university district for 17 years. My route covers the areas around major universities, cram schools, and preparatory academies where thousands of students spend their days and nights preparing for entrance exams that will determine their entire future. The academic pressure in these neighborhoods is palpable. You can see it in the exhausted faces of students walking between classes, in the worried expressions of parents dropping off their children, and in the intense atmosphere that seems to permeate every street corner. The university district has its own seasonal rhythms, with different times of year bringing different kinds of stress. Spring brings the anxiety of new admissions and the relief or devastation of exam results. Summer means intensive study programs and additional tutoring sessions. Winter is the most intense period, when entrance exam season reaches its peak and students push themselves to physical and emotional breaking points. What I'm about to tell you began in the winter of 2024 and has continued with heartbreaking regularity since then. It involves a passenger who embodies the darkest aspects of Japan's educational system, a young person whose academic pressures became so overwhelming that they transcended even death itself. The first time I saw him was on a cold February evening during peak entrance exam season. I was parked outside one of the major cram schools in Ochanomizu when a high school student approached my taxi. He was wearing the standard uniform of a preparatory academy student: dark blazer, white shirt, school bag heavy with textbooks and study materials. What struck me immediately was his appearance of complete exhaustion. His face was pale and drawn, with the kind of deep fatigue that comes from months of insufficient sleep and chronic stress. His eyes were red-rimmed and had the unfocused quality of someone who had been studying for so many hours that concentration had become physically painful. "Please take me to Tokyo University," he said as he climbed into the back seat. "I have a practice exam in 30 minutes, and I cannot be late." His voice carried the kind of desperate urgency that I had heard from many students during exam season. But there was something more intense about his anxiety, a quality of panic that suggested his entire world depended on making it to this one test on time. During the drive, he never stopped reviewing his study materials. He had flashcards, practice problems, and reference books spread across the back seat, and he studied with a frantic intensity that made me worried about his mental state. Every few seconds, he would check his phone for the time, becoming visibly more agitated as the minutes passed. "I have to get into Tokyo University," he explained, his voice shaking with stress. "My parents have sacrificed everything for my education. My father works double shifts to pay for cram school tuition. My mother gave up her career to help me study. If I fail the entrance exam, I will have destroyed their lives along with my own." The atmosphere in my taxi began to feel oppressive, with academic anxiety so intense that I started experiencing symptoms I had never felt before: chest tightness, racing heart, and an overwhelming sense that I was failing at something critically important. These weren't my own emotions, but they felt completely real while this student was in my car. As we approached Tokyo University, I expected him to gather his materials and prepare to rush to his exam. Instead, when I pulled up to the campus entrance, he looked out at the university gates with growing confusion and despair. "This isn't right," he said quietly. "The exam was supposed to be here, but I don't see any other students. Did I miss it? Did I fail before I even had the chance to try?" Before I could respond, he and all his study materials faded away from the back seat, leaving behind only the lingering scent of academic stress, the particular combination of coffee, pencil, lead, and the kind of anxiety that seeps into clothing after months of intensive studying. I drove home that night, feeling profoundly disturbed, not just by the supernatural disappearance, but by the intensity of educational pressure that had filled my taxi. For days afterward, I found myself obsessing over small mistakes in my work, convinced that minor errors would have catastrophic consequences for my livelihood and my family's security. The second encounter happened a week later, following a similar pattern but with some additional details that made the situation even more tragic. The same exhausted student, the same desperate journey to an exam he would never be able to take, the same crushing realization that his academic efforts were futile. This time, during our drive, he told me more about the pressures he was facing and the impossible expectations that had been placed on him. "I sleep 3 hours per night," he explained, still frantically reviewing his flashcards. "I attend regular high school during the day, then cram school until 10 p.m., then individual tutoring until midnight. Then I study at home until 3 a.m. My parents check my grades every week and compare them to other students in my class." He described a life that had been completely consumed by academic preparation. No friends, no hobbies, no time for rest or relaxation. Every moment of his existence was scheduled around studying, test-taking, and the relentless pursuit of the perfect entrance exam score that would secure admission to a prestigious university. The cram school counselor says, "I need to improve my ranking by at least 20 points to have a chance at Tokyo University," he continued. "But I'm already studying as hard as I can. I don't know how to do more than everything." I began researching cases of student suicide in Tokyo, particularly incidents related to entrance exam pressure. What I discovered explained my supernatural encounters, but made them infinitely more tragic. The student I was transporting, whose name I learned from news reports was Suzuki Takahiro, had taken his own life 3 years earlier. just 2 weeks before the Tokyo University entrance exam. He had been found in his bedroom, surrounded by study materials and practice tests, with a note apologizing to his parents for failing to meet their expectations. According to the news reports, Takahiro had been attending cram school for over 2 years, studying 18 hours per day in preparation for entrance exams. His parents had invested their entire savings in his education, expecting that admission to a prestigious university would guarantee his future success and justify their sacrifices. The investigation revealed that he had been showing signs of severe depression and academic burnout for months before his death. But his parents and teachers had interpreted his struggles as normal exam stress rather than a mental health crisis requiring intervention. I realized that Takahiro's spirit was trapped in his final desperate attempts to reach the entrance exams that had become more important to him than his own life. He was eternally traveling between cram schools, test centers, and universities, still trying to achieve the academic success that had been demanded of him. The encounters continued throughout the following months, always during times when entrance exam pressure was at its peak. Takahiro would appear in my taxi, frantically studying for tests he would never take, traveling to exam centers where his registration had been canceled by his death. But the most disturbing aspect of these supernatural rides was their effect on my other passengers. Anyone who rode in my taxi in the days following Takahiro's visits would be contaminated by his intense academic anxiety and perfectionist pressure. Parents would become obsessed with their children's academic performance, hiring additional tutors and enrolling them in extra cram school programs. Students would develop severe test anxiety, experiencing panic attacks during exams, and becoming convinced that any grade below perfect would ruin their futures. Some passengers would become so affected by Takahiro's academic pressure that they would change their entire life plans. A businessman quit his job to attend graduate school, convinced that his current education level was inadequate. A mother enrolled her elementary school child in multiple preparatory programs, driven by an irrational fear that waiting until high school would be too late. One high school student who rode in my taxi the day after an encounter with Takahiro developed such severe academic anxiety that he stopped attending school entirely, convinced that he would never be smart enough to pass entrance exams. His parents had to seek professional counseling to help him overcome the educational trauma he had absorbed from the contamination in my vehicle. I consulted with a Buddhist monk about how to help Takahiro find peace and cleanse my taxi of the academic pressure he left behind. The monk explained that educational spirits who died from academic pressure create particularly powerful forms of spiritual contamination because they carry the collective anxiety of an entire society that has placed too much emphasis on test scores and university admissions. This young man died believing that his worth as a person depended entirely on his academic achievement, the monk told me. His spirit continues trying to take the exams that killed him, but because he died before completing them, he can never achieve the success that might allow him to rest. He carries with him the accumulated pressure of every student who has been pushed beyond their limits by educational expectations. The monk suggested that Takahiro's presence was so contaminating because academic pressure touches something fundamental in Japanese society. The entrance exam system affects not just individual students, but entire families and communities who have invested their hopes and resources in educational success. The encounters continue to this day, following the seasonal rhythm of Japan's academic calendar. Every winter, during entrance exam season, Takahiro appears in my taxi with his study materials, desperately trying to reach test centers where he can finally prove his worth through academic achievement. I've learned to carry protective amulets during exam season and to perform cleansing rituals after encounters with academic spirits. I warn other drivers about the psychological hazards of transporting students who carry such concentrated educational anxiety. But I continue working in the university district during entrance exam season, partly because the income is good during busy academic periods, and partly because I feel that Takahiro's story needs to be witnessed. His eternal studying serves as a reminder of what happens when academic pressure becomes more important than mental health and human well-being. The study materials he carries represent more than just textbooks and practice tests. They symbolize the dreams and expectations that families place on their children, the economic pressures that force parents to invest everything in their children's education, and the social systems that evaluate human worth through test scores and university rankings. Sometimes, I wonder if Takahiro will ever find the academic success he's seeking, or if he's destined to repeat his desperate study sessions forever. The entrance exams he's trying to take have been replaced by newer tests, and the universities he's trying to enter have changed their admission requirements since his death. His academic pressure continues to contaminate everyone who encounters it, because educational anxiety is something that almost every family in Japan understands. Parents recognize the desperation of someone who believes their child's future depends on perfect test scores, and students identify with the crushing weight of expectations that can make academic failure seem worse than death. Takahiro's eternal exam preparation serves as a warning about the hidden costs of Japan's competitive educational system, a reminder that academic achievement becomes meaningless when it requires sacrificing the mental health and lives of the students who are supposed to benefit from it. The Typhoon Night Rescue. My name is Ogawa Tetsuo, and I have been working as an emergency taxi driver in Tokyo for 13 years. While most drivers avoid working during severe weather, I specialize in emergency transport during natural disasters, typhoons, earthquakes, and other situations when public transportation shuts down and people need help getting to safety. It's dangerous work that requires special training and equipment, but it pays well and serves an important community function during times when ordinary transportation services cannot operate. Emergency driving during typhoon season is particularly challenging. The combination of high winds, flooding, and power outages creates conditions that test both vehicle capabilities and human judgment. I work closely with disaster response authorities, hospital emergency rooms, and evacuation centers to provide transportation for people who cannot reach safety through normal channels. What I'm about to tell you began during Typhoon Hagibis in October 2019 and has continued every typhoon season since then. It involves passengers who represent one of Japan's most persistent problems: the gap between official disaster preparedness plans and the reality of what happens when catastrophic weather overwhelms emergency response systems. The first supernatural encounter happened during the height of Typhoon Hagibis, when wind speeds reached over 100 kilometers per hour and rainfall exceeded anything Tokyo had experienced in decades. I was parked at an emergency staging area when my radio crackled with a desperate call from dispatch. Emergency pickup needed at Tamagawa River area. Family with elderly members and small children trapped by rising floodwater. Standard evacuation routes are blocked. You're the only driver in position to reach them. The Tamagawa River area was known for flood problems during heavy storms, but the dispatch description suggested this was an extreme situation requiring immediate response. I drove carefully through the storm toward the coordinates I had been given, fighting strong winds that threatened to push my reinforced taxi off the road. As I approached the location, my radio crackled again with a voice that sounded different from the regular dispatch operator. "Please hurry. The water is rising faster than we expected. We have 3 generations of family here, including an 80-year-old grandmother and twin toddlers. We're on the 2nd floor, but we don't think the building will hold." When I arrived at the address, I expected to see a partially flooded residential building with people waiting for rescue on upper floors. Instead, I found myself at the edge of what looked like a lake, where a neighborhood used to be. The water was dark and filled with debris, and there were no visible buildings or people anywhere in the flooded area. I radioed back to dispatch. I'm at the coordinates, but the entire area is completely underwater. There are no structures visible and no signs of survivors. The response came back in the same desperate voice I had heard earlier. We can see your headlights from our window. Please come closer to the building. We're waving from the second-floor window facing the street. Looking out at the flooded area, I could see no lights, no buildings, and certainly no people waving from windows. But my taxi radio continued picking up increasingly frantic calls for help from the trapped family. The water is coming through the floor now, came the voice. Grandmother can't swim, and the children are terrified. Please, we can pay whatever you charge. We just need help getting to the evacuation center. Despite seeing no evidence of survivors at the location, I felt compelled to respond to their calls. I carefully drove my taxi as far into the flooded area as safety would allow, following what seemed to be the remnants of a road under several feet of water. As my vehicle moved through the flood zone, something extraordinary and terrifying began to happen. The interior of my taxi started filling with wind and rain, even though all the windows were closed and the vehicle was sealed. Water began rising around my ankles, and I could feel the powerful gusts of the typhoon inside the passenger compartment. 3 figures materialized in my back seat: an elderly woman, a middle-aged man, and a young woman holding 2 small children. They were all completely soaked and shivering, and the children were crying with terror. "Thank you for coming," the middle-aged man said, his voice shaking with relief and exhaustion. "We thought no one was going to help us. We've been calling for rescue for 6 hours, but they kept saying all emergency vehicles were busy with higher priority calls." As I drove through the flooded streets toward what should have been an evacuation center, the phantom passengers told me about their ordeal. They had been trapped in their apartment building as the Tamagawa River overflowed its banks much faster than official flood predictions had indicated. "The evacuation warnings came too late," the young woman explained, holding the terrified toddlers close to her chest. "By the time they told us to leave, the roads were already underwater. We called the emergency hotline, but they said standard rescue vehicles couldn't reach our area and we would have to wait for specialized equipment." The elderly grandmother, speaking with the weak voice of someone who had been through a traumatic ordeal, added, "We kept calling and calling, but they said there were hundreds of other families also trapped. They told us to stay calm and wait, but the water kept rising." As we drove through the storm-filled night, the water level inside my taxi continued rising, reaching my knees and making it difficult to operate the pedals safely. The wind inside the vehicle was so strong that it was hard to hear the passengers speaking, but gradually their voices became fainter and more distant. When I finally reached the coordinates for the evacuation center, I found another flooded area with no visible buildings or people. My phantom passengers looked out at the empty floodwater with growing despair. "This was supposed to be the safe place," the man said quietly. "They told us the evacuation center could handle everyone from our district, but there's nothing here." One by one, the family members began to fade away, starting with the elderly grandmother and ending with the mother and her children. As they disappeared, the water and wind inside my taxi receded, leaving behind only the memory of their desperate voices and the overwhelming sense of abandonment that filled the space where they had been sitting. I spent the rest of that night researching the locations where I had picked up and dropped off my phantom passengers. What I discovered explained the supernatural encounter, but made it infinitely more tragic. During Typhoon Hagibis, the Tamagawa River area had experienced unprecedented flooding that overwhelmed all emergency response capabilities. Hundreds of families had been trapped in rapidly rising water, but rescue resources had been insufficient to reach everyone who needed help. The family I had transported, the Yamamoto family, consisting of 3 generations, had died in their apartment building while waiting for rescue that never came. They had spent over 8 hours calling emergency services, being told repeatedly that help was on the way, but emergency vehicles had been unable to reach their location due to the severity of the flooding. The evacuation center they had been directed to had also been flooded and abandoned hours before they tried to reach it. The official disaster response plan had not accounted for the possibility that both residential areas and emergency facilities could be simultaneously compromised by the same flood event. I realized that the Yamamoto family's spirits were trapped in their final desperate attempt to reach safety during a natural disaster that had exposed the inadequacies of Japan's emergency preparedness systems. Over the following typhoon seasons, I continued to receive emergency calls from families who had died during inadequate disaster response situations. Always during the worst storms, always from locations that had been abandoned by emergency services, always ending at evacuation centers that had been compromised or never properly established. Each phantom rescue followed the same heartbreaking pattern. Desperate families calling for help that would come too late. Emergency transportation through floodwaters that had already claimed their lives. Arrival at safe zones that existed only in emergency planning documents rather than physical reality. The psychological impact of these encounters extended far beyond the supernatural experiences themselves. Anyone who rode in my taxi in the weeks following these phantom rescues would be contaminated by the survivors' guilt and governmental distrust that the deceased families had experienced in their final hours. Passengers would become obsessed with disaster preparedness, stockpiling emergency supplies and developing elaborate evacuation plans based on their loss of faith in official emergency response systems. Others would become convinced that government disaster planning was fundamentally inadequate and would refuse to follow official evacuation instructions during actual emergencies. The contamination was so severe that some passengers would move away from flood-prone areas entirely, convinced that they could not rely on emergency services to help them if disaster struck. Others would develop such severe anxiety about natural disasters that they would monitor weather forecasts obsessively and evacuate at the first sign of severe weather, regardless of official recommendations. I consulted with emergency management officials about how to improve disaster response systems based on what I had learned from my phantom passengers. But I discovered that many of the same systemic problems that had killed the Yamamoto family still existed. Insufficient rescue vehicles, inadequate coordination between agencies, and emergency plans that had not been tested under actual catastrophic conditions. A Buddhist monk I spoke with explained that disaster spirits are among the most persistent forms of supernatural contamination because they represent collective failures of community protection systems. These families died believing that their society would protect them from natural disasters, he told me. When that protection failed, it created spiritual wounds that affect everyone who encounters their energy. They carry with them the accumulated fear of every person who has been abandoned by the systems that were supposed to keep them safe. The encounters continue every typhoon season. As storms approach Tokyo, I receive emergency calls from families who died during past disasters, still seeking the rescue that never came when they were alive. My taxi fills with floodwater and typhoon winds as I transport them through disaster zones toward evacuation centers that failed them when they needed help most. I've learned to carry extra emergency equipment and to document the locations where phantom rescues occur, hoping that this information might help improve disaster response for living families who face similar emergencies. But the most lasting impact has been understanding how natural disasters can expose the gap between official emergency planning and the reality of what happens when catastrophic events overwhelm available resources. The phantom families continue their eternal search for safety that should have been provided by emergency response systems, and I continue to serve as their driver, transporting them through disaster zones toward rescue that will always be too little, too late. Each typhoon season brings new phantom passengers, victims of floods, landslides, and storm damage, who died because emergency resources were insufficient to reach everyone who needed help. Their continued presence serves as a reminder that natural disasters are often made more deadly by human failures in disaster preparedness and emergency response. The wind and rain that fill my taxi during these phantom rescues represent more than just weather phenomena. They symbolize the storms of abandonment and systemic failure that can be more devastating than the natural disasters themselves.